I used to think the mountains were quiet, peaceful, even. The kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat if you stood still long enough. But what no one tells you, what they don't print on park brochures or warn you about in training, is that silence, true silence, is rarely empty, especially in Timberline Ridge. It was my third year as a ranger when I was assigned to the Timberline Fire Watch Tower. Elevation, 9,200 feet. Population, just me. My job? Rotate night shifts with two others, Rick and Mason, watching for smoke across endless miles of tree-covered wilderness. Sounds simple, right? But on my second night, I saw something in the fog. It wasn't a hiker. It wasn't wildlife. It didn't belong. It stood still at the edge of the tree line, too tall, too rigid, staring up at the tower. No flashlight, no gear, just watching. And when I looked again, it was closer. You ever feel your mind trying to make sense of something that simply shouldn't exist? That's what happened to me. My instincts screamed one thing while logic begged for another explanation. But trust me, once you've seen something watching you in the fog with no eyes, no face, and no reason to be there, you'll never sleep the same way again. And that was only the beginning. I arrived at Timberline in early October, right when the first cold snaps rolled in and the tourists rolled out. The tower was remote, 40 minutes by snowcat from the nearest ranger station. That's not an exaggeration. 40 bone-rattling minutes in a tangle of switchbacks, dead pine stumps, and narrow ridge passes that seemed to twist back on themselves like a maze designed by something that didn't want visitors. The driver, an older maintenance worker named Pete, barely spoke during the climb. Every few minutes, he'd glance in the rearview mirror, checking the path behind us with a kind of nervous attention you'd expect from someone being followed. When I asked him about it, he just grunted and said the mountains played tricks on your eyes. The way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself more than me, made my skin crawl. The Timberline Tower was old but sturdy, 60 feet tall with steel supports that sang in the wind like tuning forks. The wraparound observation deck groaned under your weight, a constant reminder of how high up you were, how far from help. It had a tiny kitchen with a propane stove that hissed when you lit it, a cot that squeaked with every movement, a CB radio that crackled with static even when no one was transmitting, and binoculars permanently mounted to the north window, the glass scratched and fogged as if previous rangers had pressed their faces against the lenses for hours at a time. The handover was quick. Rick, the ranger I was replacing for the week, barely said a word. He looked worn down, eyes sunken deep in their sockets like he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled slightly as he passed me the tower keys, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that lived in his bones now. "Don't look too long at the fog," he said flatly, as if he were reminding me not to stare at the sun. The way he said it, like a warning he'd given before, made me think it was more than just advice. I thought it was a joke. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. As Rick gathered his gear, moving with the jerky, urgent motions of someone desperate to leave, he paused at the door. "You hear breathing that isn't yours," he said without turning around. "Don't go looking for it. Sometimes the mountain breathes back." Then he was gone, practically running down those metal stairs, the sound of his boots echoing off the mountainside long after I lost sight of him in the trees. Mason was already up there with a thermos in hand, steam rising from the cup like incense. He was younger than Rick, maybe mid-30s, but his eyes held the same hollow look. The look of someone who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it. "You'll get used to the silence," he said, offering me the cot. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a tremor that suggested he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. "If you don't, it gets loud." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just stared out the north window, watching the fog roll between the peaks like slow-motion avalanches. "You'll know," he said finally. "When the quiet starts making noise, you'll know." That first night was calm, deceptively so. The view from the tower was surreal, mist threading between pines like river smoke, flowing and pooling in the valleys below. The moon hung low and bruised, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. I stood out on the deck, sipping instant coffee that tasted like burnt metal and watching clouds of fog roll like living things, pulsing and breathing with a rhythm that seemed almost organic. The temperature dropped as midnight approached. My breath came in visible puffs, and the metal railings grew slick with condensation. The fog thickened, rising from the valleys like something stirring from sleep. That's when I first noticed how complete the silence was. Not just quiet, empty. No insects. No night birds. No rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But at around 3 a.m., the radio crackled to life, making me jump so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Look out east. Just look. Mason's voice was tight, compressed, like he was speaking through clenched teeth. I turned, my heart still hammering from the sudden noise. There, standing just past the timberline where the trees gave way to bare rock and alpine grass, was a tall, dark figure. Not moving. No light. No detail. Just a silhouette against the fog, impossibly still in a way that hurt to look at. Watching. It was too tall to be human. Too perfectly motionless to be alive. But there was something about its posture, the way it held itself, the angle of what might have been its head, that suggested intelligence. Purpose. Like it was studying me the same way I was studying it. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, convince myself it was a trick of the light. The fog thickened, and it was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after the shape vanished, crawling along my spine like cold fingers. I spent the rest of the night checking that window, scanning the tree lean with a mounted binoculars, but I saw nothing except fog and shadows that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely. When dawn broke and Mason returned for his shift, I told him what I'd seen. He just nodded, unsurprised, and said, "It's awake again." Over the next few nights, I started seeing it more often. Always in the fog, always watching, never moving, at least not when I was looking directly at it. But I began to notice it appearing in different spots along the tree lean, as if it had been moving while my attention was elsewhere. A game of deadly statue, played across miles of wilderness. I told myself it was a tree stump. Trick of light. My mind trying to create patterns in the chaos of mist and shadow. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembers when humans were prey, I knew better. Whatever I was seeing wasn't natural. Wasn't supposed to be there. The locals in town, the few who would talk about Timberline at all, had stories. Old stories. They spoke in whispers about things that lived in the high places, things that were here long before the first trappers and miners carved their way into these mountains. Things that didn't appreciate visitors. But those were just stories. Folklore. The kind of tales people told to scare tourists and explain away the occasional missing hiker. On night 5, it got worse. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen it. From the observation deck, I couldn't see past the base of the tower. The world had become a white void, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on my chest until each breath became a conscious effort. I was on deck, trying to peer through the impenetrable wall of mist, when I heard the first footstep. Crisp, deliberate. The sound of something heavy crunching pine needles beneath its weight, each step placed with careful precision. Then another, and another. Slow, patient, circling the tower in a wide arc that I could track by sound alone. Whatever was walking down there was taking its time, as if it had all night, as if it knew I wasn't going anywhere. My heart hammered against my ribs as I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were definitely circling, first from the east, then south, then west, getting closer with each revolution, tightening the spiral like a noose. I shuffled quietly to the far side of the deck, trying to stay opposite from wherever the sounds were coming from. The metal grating under my feet seemed impossibly loud in the silence, each movement a betrayal of my position. I pressed myself against the railing and looked down, squinting into the fog. Nothing but white. A world erased. But I could hear it. The steady crunch of footsteps, now directly beneath me. And worse, I could feel it. A presence so alien and wrong that every instinct I had screamed at me to run, even though there was nowhere to go. Then the footsteps stopped, right beneath the tower. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the walking. In that quiet, I became hyper-aware of every sound, the whistle of wind through the tower's supports, the settling groans of metal, my own ragged breathing. And underneath it all, barely audible, something else. Breathing. Not mine. Slower. Deeper. The kind of breathing that comes from lungs much larger than human ones. It went on for minutes, long, measured inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from directly below me. Sometimes it would pause, as if whatever was down there was listening, waiting, testing the air like a predator scenting prey. I locked every door, turned off all lights, and sat with my back to the wall, clutching the emergency flare gun with shaking hands. The breathing continued, occasionally punctuated by small sounds, the scrape of something against the tower's support beams, a wet sliding noise that might have been skin against metal. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time loses meaning when you're trapped in a box 60 feet in the air, listening to something inhuman breathing beneath you in the dark. When dawn finally broke and the fog began to lift, the breathing stopped. The presence, that overwhelming sense of being watched, hunted, faded like smoke. But I waited another hour before I worked up the courage to unlock the doors and venture down. At the base of the tower, I found footprints. Huge ones. Not boot prints, bare feet, if you could call them that. At least 15 inches long and narrow, with what looked like elongated toes that ended in deep gouges in the earth. The prints formed a perfect circle around the tower, each one pressed deep into the ground as if made by something impossibly heavy. But it was the details that made my blood turn to ice. The prints weren't quite human. The proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, with spaces between the toes that suggested webbing or membrane. And in the center of each print was a dark stain, as if whatever had made them was bleeding from its feet. Human? Maybe if humans could grow to 8 feet tall and develop feet like a nightmare fusion of man and beast. But what kind of person walks barefoot in sub-freezing temperatures alone at 9,200 feet through jagged terrain sharp enough to shred hiking boots? Mason came up for the next shift that afternoon, and when I told him about the footsteps, the breathing, the prints, he didn't laugh. He didn't even look surprised. He just went pale, staring down at the circle of tracks like he was reading his own obituary. "It's still here then," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Still?" I asked. Mason looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "It never really left," he said. "Just sleeps sometimes. Between watchers. Between watchers." The phrase sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What does it want?" I asked. Mason started up the stairs, his boots clanging on each step like a countdown. At the top, he turned back to me with an expression I'll never forget. Part pity, part terror, part resignation. "Company," he said. 3 days later, we got a report of a missing hiker, Jonathan Greer, age 32. A software engineer from Denver who'd taken a week off work to clear his head with some solo backpacking. Hadn't returned from his trip. His girlfriend had called the Rangers when he failed to show up for their dinner date, 2 days overdue. Last known location, Timberline Basin, just 2 miles northeast of our tower. I volunteered to join the search, partly out of duty and partly because I was desperate for daylight company and a reason to leave the tower behind, even temporarily. The search team consisted of myself, Mason, 2 other Rangers, and a search dog named Ranger, a German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a nose that could track a scent through a thunderstorm. We found his tent after 6 hours of searching, tucked into a sheltered grove near Timberline Creek. The sight of it made my stomach drop like a stone. The tent was ripped open from the inside. Not cut or torn by claws, ripped, as if someone had grabbed the fabric and pulled with superhuman strength until it gave way. The tiers were too clean, too purposeful to be the work of a panicked animal. They looked deliberate, surgical. Inside, everything was scattered but not destroyed. His sleeping bag was pulled aside, his backpack overturned but not rifled through. No blood, no signs of struggle, no gear missing except for the hiker himself. It was as if Jonathan Greer had simply vanished mid-action, leaving behind only the evidence of his presence. But we did find his journal. The leather-bound notebook was lying open beside his sleeping bag, a pen still clipped to the cover as if he'd been writing when something interrupted him. The earlier entries were normal, observations about the weather, notes about wildlife, sketches of mountain vistas. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting grew shakier, more hurried. The observations became different. Day 3, saw something moving in the fog this morning. Too tall to be a person. Thought it might be a bear standing upright, but bears don't stand that still. Watched it for maybe 10 minutes before it just faded back into the mist. Probably just my imagination. Day 4, heard footsteps around the tent last night. Slow, heavy steps circling the campsite. Called out hello, but got no answer. Found prints this morning, huge bare feet. Who the hell hikes barefoot up here? Day 5, it's back. Standing just at the edge of sight, watching. I can feel its eyes on me even when I can't see it through the fog. Tried to approach it earlier, but every step I took toward it, it seemed to get further away. Like distance itself was bending around it. Day 6, can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I feel it getting closer. The fog is so thick I can barely see my own hands, but I know it's out there, waiting. When the wind dies down, I can hear it breathing. Deep, slow breaths like something savoring the air. The last entry was scribbled in frantic loops, the pen pressed so hard it had torn through the paper in places. Day 7, saw it again. The tall thing. It doesn't blink. Doesn't breathe when I'm looking directly at it. I think it waits for the fog. The silence is loud now. I can hear it humming in my ears like electricity. Can't sleep. It stands just outside the tent flap now. I can see its shadow through the fabric. Long and wrong and watching. When I shine my flashlight at it, there's nothing there, but the shadow remains. God help me. I think it wants me to follow it into the fog. The urge is getting stronger. Like a voice in my head saying, come see what's waiting in the white. That was where the writing stopped. The pen was still in his hand when we found him, or rather, when we didn't find him. We searched for 3 more days. Ranger followed the scent trail for maybe 50 yards before he started whimpering and refused to go further, hackles raised and ears flattened against his head. Even with treats and encouragement, he wouldn't budge. He found something that scared him on a primal level, something that made every instinct he had screamed danger. No sign of Greer. Not then. Not ever. But we did find something else. About 100 yards from his tent, following what might have been a game trail deeper into the forest, we discovered a series of impressions in the soft earth. Not quite footprints, more like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. The impressions led toward a steep ravine filled with fog, so thick it looked solid, a white wall that seemed to swallow sound and light. At the edge of the ravine, the drag marks simply ended, as if whatever had been pulled there had been lifted into the air, or had walked into the fog and never come out. That night, alone in the tower again, while Mason took personal leave to process what we'd found, I felt a presence stronger than ever before. Not imagined. Not subtle. Undeniable. The binoculars picked it up around 4 a.m., standing just at the edge of a fog bank that seemed to move with unnatural purpose. Still, tall, waiting. But this time, there was something different about its posture. Something expectant. Through the binoculars, I could make out more detail than I'd ever wanted to see. It was humanoid but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, joints that bent in directions that made my eyes water to follow. And its face. I forced myself to keep looking, even as every instinct screamed at me to look away. Where a face should have been was a smooth expanse of what might have been skin, broken only by a horizontal slit that was too wide to be a mouth. No eyes that I could see, but somehow I knew it was looking at me with the focused intensity of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand. Not to wave. The gesture was too purposeful for that, too loaded with meaning I didn't want to understand. To point directly at me. The moment that finger aimed at my heart, every light in the tower flickered. The radio erupted in static, so loud it felt like feedback in my skull. And somewhere, impossibly, I heard Jonathan Greer's voice mixed in with the white noise, calling out in desperate, wordless terror. I dropped the binoculars, my hand shaking so badly I could barely work the radio. It crackled to life before I could even reach for it. Mason's voice, tight with panic. Get out of there. It's climbing. What? The stairs. Get out. I lunged toward the trapdoor, my feet slipping on the suddenly slick floor as if the tower itself was trying to hold me back. The bolt was old and stiff, and for one terrifying moment I thought it wouldn't turn. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it, sweat mixing with the condensation that had somehow formed on every surface despite the below-freezing temperature. Finally, the bolt slammed home with a metallic clang that echoed through the small space like a gunshot. I dragged the heavy cot over the trapdoor, its metal legs screaming against the floor, and backed into the corner, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape my chest entirely. The first metallic clang came immediately, weight hitting the lowest step of the external staircase with the sound of a church bell tolling. Then another. Then another. Slow. Deliberate. Patient. Each step sent vibrations up through the tower's steel frame, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where the tower's shaking ended and my own terror began. Whatever was climbing wasn't in any hurry. It didn't need to be. It knew I had nowhere to go. The stairs groaned under the weight, deep metallic groans that spoke of stress the structure was never designed to handle. I climbed those stairs hundreds of times over the past weeks, knew every step, every loose bolt, every place where the metal sang in the wind. This was different. This was the sound of infrastructure being tested beyond its limits. I grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it twice. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring, solid, real, something I could use to fight back against whatever was coming for me. But looking at the single flare cartridge, I realized how inadequate it was against something that could climb 60 feet of steel stairs without breaking stride. The radio crackled again, Mason's voice cutting through the static. Don't let it reach the top. Don't see its face. Then nothing but white noise, as if something had severed the connection between us. 20 steps away. 15. 10. The vibrations were constant now, shaking dust from the ceiling, making the windows rattle in their frames. I could hear each individual step, a precise, methodical rhythm that never varied, never hesitated. Whatever was climbing had done this before. 5 steps away. I crept to the trapdoor, pressing my ear to the wood. Below, I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound like wind through a cave, hollow and vast and wrong. There was a wet quality to it, like air passing over something that should have been dry. 3 steps. 2. I pulled the cot tighter against the trapdoor, bracing my feet against the wall, putting every ounce of my weight behind it. The wood groaned under the pressure, but held. 1 step. Then silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full, pregnant with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. The tower had stopped shaking, but somehow that was worse than the constant vibration. In the stillness, I became hyper-aware of every sound, my ragged breathing, the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through gaps in the windows. I waited, muscles locked, sweat freezing on my skin despite the adrenaline burning through my veins. Then a single tap on the window behind me. Not the sound of wind or debris. A deliberate knock, knuckles against glass, patient and polite and absolutely terrifying in its normalcy. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming not to look. The window was fogged with condensation, but through the haze I could make out a shape pressed against the glass. Not quite a silhouette, more like a shadow cast by something that existed in too many dimensions at once. Another tap, more insistent this time. I raised the flare gun, trying to aim at the center of the shape, but my hands were shaking so badly the barrel waved like a pendulum. The thing at the window seemed to notice my movement because the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was perfect stillness. Then the condensation on the glass began to clear, as if something on the other side was breathing on it, warming it. Patterns emerged in the fog, not random, but deliberate, like fingerprints, like a palm pressed against the glass, like a face. What looked back at me wasn't human. Couldn't be human. The proportions were wrong, stretched and elongated like someone had taken a person and pulled them through a funhouse mirror. Where eyes should have been were hollow sockets that seemed to go back further than the skull should allow. The mouth was a horizontal gash too wide for any human face, revealing depths that the laws of anatomy said shouldn't exist. But worst of all was the expression. Not rage or hunger or any emotion I could recognize. Just curiosity. The patient, analytical interest of something studying a specimen. It tilted its head too far, joints moving in ways that made my vision blur, and pressed closer to the glass. The window began to bow inward under the pressure, stress fractures spider webbing across the surface. I fired the flare gun. The explosion of light and heat was blinding in a small space. Glass exploded outward in a shower of glittering fragments, and for one terrible moment the thing's outline was perfectly visible, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, joints that bent backward and forward simultaneously. Then it was gone. Not fallen. Gone. Like it had never been there at all. The stairs went silent. The pressure against the trapdoor vanished. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I crouched in a corner, clutching the empty flare gun, waiting for the next attack. But it never came. When dawn finally broke hours later, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red, I was still there, still waiting, still listening for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. I didn't sleep. I'm not sure I ever slept properly again. When Mason arrived by Snowcat the next morning, he looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Dark bags shadowed his eyes, making them appear sunken in his skull. A fresh bruise spread across his left cheek, purple and black and angry, and his hand shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. I heard it too, he said before I could even speak, his voice hoarse as if he'd been screaming. Last week, I saw it climb halfway up and then just vanish. Thought I imagined it. Wanted to imagine it. He paused at the base of the tower, looking up at the broken window with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. What happened to your face? I asked. Mason touched the bruise gingerly, wincing at the contact. Walked into a door, he said, but his eyes didn't meet mine. In the dark. You know how it is. I didn't believe him, but I let it slide. We both had bigger problems. We went down together to examine the tower's base, and what we found made my blood run cold all over again. The steel support beams were scorched black in places, metal twisted and warped as if exposed to intense heat. The scorch marks formed patterns, not random burn damage, but deliberate shapes that hurt to look at directly. Symbols, maybe, or writing in some alphabet that predated human language. But there was no body. No remains. Nothing to suggest that my flare had actually hit anything solid. Instead, there was a trail. A thick, oily red line that wasn't quite blood and wasn't quite oil started at the base of the tower and stretched into the forest. It was dark enough to be almost black, with an iridescent quality that made it shimmer with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Where it touched the ground, the pine needles had withered and died, leaving small patches of barren earth that looked poisoned. The smell was worse than the sight, copper and sulfur and something organic gone wrong, like meat left to rot in summer heat. It made my eyes water and my stomach clench with nausea. Jesus, Mason whispered, covering his nose with his sleeve. What is that? I knelt beside the trail, careful not to touch it. Up close, I could see it wasn't just liquid. There were solid chunks mixed in dark masses that might have been tissue or might have been something else entirely. Something that had once been part of whatever I'd shot. The trail led north, deeper into the forest where the trees grew thick enough to block out most of the sky. We followed it for what felt like miles, moving slowly, carefully, neither of us wanting to get too close to that poisonous red line but unable to look away from it either. The trail never wavered, never showed signs of whatever was bleeding slowing down or growing weak. If anything, it seemed to get thicker as we went deeper into the woods, as if the wound was getting worse instead of better. After about a mile, we reached a clearing I'd never seen before despite all my time watching the forest from the tower. It was perfectly circular, maybe 50 feet across, with no trees or undergrowth, just bare earth that looked like it had been scoured clean. In the center of the clearing was a depression, roughly human-shaped but far too large, as if something enormous had been lying there for a very long time. The red trail led directly to this depression and then just ended. Not faded or dried up. Ended. As if whatever was bleeding had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. Mason and I stood at the edge of the clearing, neither of us willing to step onto that barren ground. The silence here was different from the tower, not empty, but full of potential, like the moment before an avalanche. This isn't the first time, Mason said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him. His face was pale, almost gray, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. What do you mean? Mason stared at the depression in the center of the clearing, and I could see him wrestling with something, a decision, maybe, or a memory he'd been trying to forget. There was a ranger named Laramie, he said finally. Before my time, before yours. Way before. This was back in '87, when they were just starting to use the tower for fire watch. He paused, licking his lips nervously. Laramie was experienced. 20 years in the parks, knew these mountains like his own backyard. But one night mid-shift he just left. Abandoned his post. They found his radio still transmitting, his coffee still warm, his boots sitting right by the door like he just stepped out of them. What happened to him? They searched for weeks. Brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. Never found so much as a piece of clothing. Mason's voice dropped to almost nothing. But they did find something else. A trail. Dark red, just like this one. Led from the tower deep into the forest, and then just stopped. He pointed at the depression in the clearing. Right here. Same spot. The implications hit me like a physical blow. How many? I asked. How many rangers have gone missing? Mason was quiet for a long moment, counting on his fingers. 7 that I know of, he said finally. Going back 40 years. Always the same pattern. They vanished from the tower, always during fog, always leaving behind boots in that red trail. Why didn't anyone tell me? Would you have taken a job if they had? He had a point. But the anger that bubbled up in my chest was real and hot. People have a right to know what they're walking into. Do they? Mason turned to look at me, and his eyes were haunted. What would you tell them? That there's something in the fog that watches rangers and sometimes makes them disappear? That we've been feeding it people for 4 decades and nobody knows how to make it stop? We could close the tower. Find another way to watch for fires. Mason laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think we haven't tried? Every time they shut it down, the disappearances just move to other towers, other rangers. It doesn't care about the building. It cares about the watchers. The word hit me like ice water in my veins. Watchers. The same word Mason had used before, spoken with the weight of ritual and resignation. It's not random, I realized. It's not just taking people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's specifically hunting rangers. Specifically hunting us. Mason nodded grimly. Something about what we do, the watching, the isolation, the long nights staring into the fog, it draws its attention. Like we're sending it an invitation every time we climb those stairs. We stood in that poison clearing for another few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Mason broke the silence. "We should go," he said. "This place, it's not good to stay here too long. Sometimes people who spend too much time here start to hear things. Voices calling from the depression. Promises of answers if you just step a little closer." As if summoned by his words, the sound drifted across the clearing, faint but unmistakable. A voice, calling from somewhere deep in that human-shaped hollow. It was speaking words I couldn't quite make out, in a tone that was almost familiar. Almost like Jonathan Greer. Mason grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the forest trail. "Don't listen," he hissed. "Don't try to understand what it's saying. That's how it gets you." But as we hurried away from that cursed clearing, I could swear I heard my own name mixed in with the whispered promises drifting up from the earth. Back at the ranger station, the familiar bustle of normal life felt like stepping into another world. Rangers coming and going on regular patrols, filing mundane reports about trail conditions and wildlife sightings, complaining about broken equipment and budget cuts. The ordinary problems of ordinary people living ordinary lives. I envied them their ignorance. Mason helped me search the station's basement storage area, a maze of metal shelving units and cardboard boxes that stretched back into shadows the overhead fluorescents couldn't quite reach. Decades of paperwork and equipment moldered down there. Old reports, broken radios, camping gear that hadn't been used since the Reagan administration. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked, pulling down a box labeled Firewatch 1985 to 1990. "Evidence," Mason said. "Documentation. Something that proves we're not losing our minds." We found them in a box marked Audio Logs Archived. Dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled with dates, ranger names, and shift assignments. Most were routine. Weather reports, wildlife observations, the mundane chatter of people trying to stay awake through long, lonely nights. But some were different. Mason held up a tape labeled Laramie, Final Week, October 1987, with hands that trembled slightly. The plastic case was cracked with age, the label faded but still legible in Laramie's careful handwriting. "I've never listened to this one," he admitted. "Found it years ago, but I wasn't ready." We located an old cassette player in the corner, covered in dust and connected to speakers that had seen better decades. The tape clicked into place with a sound like breaking bones. Static filled the room, then Laramie's voice emerged from the speakers, young, confident, nothing like the broken man Mason had described. October 15th, 1987. Ranger Laramie reporting. Weather clear, visibility excellent. No sign of fire activity in sectors 7 through 12. Coffee's terrible as usual. Standard stuff. But as the dates progressed, his tone began to change. October 18th, third night of fog. Visibility near zero. Thought I saw lights moving in the tree line around 0300 hours, but when I checked with binoculars, nothing there. Probably just reflection off the mist. October 20th fog's been constant for 5 days now. Starting to feel like I'm living inside a cloud. Saw that light again last night, but this time it seemed closer. More defined. Almost like a figure carrying a lantern. But who the hell will be hiking in this weather? October 22nd. Can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. Keep catching movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, it's just fog. The silence is getting to me. It's too complete, too perfect. Even the wind has stopped. It's like the whole mountain is holding its breath. Mason and I exchanged glances. The parallels to my own experience were impossible to ignore. October 24th. It's not fog. I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. Fog doesn't move with purpose. Fog doesn't avoid certain areas. Fog doesn't respond when you shine lights at it. But this stuff does. It's like it's alive. Like it's thinking. Laramie's voice was getting tighter, more strained with each entry. I could hear the slow unraveling of a rational mind trying to process something that defied rational explanation. October 26th saw it clearly tonight. Not just lights or shapes in the fog, a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, standing just at the edge of visibility. When I focused the binoculars on it, the lenses fogged up instantly, like something was breathing on them from the inside. But I could still see its outline. God help me, I think it waved at me. October 28th. It's getting closer every night. Started at the tree lean, maybe half a mile away. Last night it was at the base of the tower. I could hear it moving around down there, circling like a predator. Found prints this morning, bare feet but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow. Whatever's making them isn't human. The tape hissed and popped, Laramie's breathing audible in the background. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. October 30th, Halloween tomorrow. How's that for cosmic timing? It spoke to me tonight. Not out loud, I never heard a voice. But the words appeared in my head like someone was writing them directly on my brain. It said it's been waiting. Waiting for someone who understands. Someone who can see properly. Static overwhelmed the speakers for several seconds. When Laramie's voice returned, it was different. Dreamy. Disconnected. November 1st. All Saints' Day. How appropriate. I understand now. The fog isn't hiding it, the fog is it. A living thing that exists in the spaces between spaces, in the quiet moments when the world holds its breath. It's beautiful, really. Ancient and patient and so very lonely. It just wants company. Someone to share the silence with. Mason reached for the stop button, but I caught his wrist. We had to hear the rest. November 2nd. Final entry. I can see it clearly now, standing right outside the window. Not threatening. Inviting. It's showing me things, visions of the mountain as it was before humans came, before we carved our roads and built our towers and filled the silence with our noise. It remembers when this was all wilderness, all peace. It wants to take me there, to show me what we've lost. A long pause, filled only with the whisper of tape moving through the machine. I'm going to go with it tonight. I know how that sounds, but I'm not crazy. I'm more sane than I've ever been. The world is too loud, too bright, too full of meaningless chatter. But the fog is quiet. The fog understands. If anyone finds this, don't mourn for me. I'm going somewhere better. Somewhere quiet. The fog's thick tonight. Been seeing that thing again. Oh, looks like it's made of smoke and bones. If I stare too long, I hear a voice. Not loud. Not in my ears. In my head. It says, join the silence. I think it's calling me. The rest was static, white noise that seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own. Like breathing. Like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. We sat in the basement silence for a long time after the tape ended, both of us processing what we'd heard. Finally, Mason spoke. 7 rangers, he said quietly. 7 people who heard that same voice, felt that same pull. And every single one of them walked into the fog and never came back. I rewound the tape and played the last entry again, focusing on Laramie's tone. There was no fear in his voice, no desperation. If anything, he sounded peaceful. Like a man who'd finally found the answer to a question that had been plaguing him for years. That scared me more than any amount of terror would have. We have to destroy these, I said suddenly. All of them. If someone else hears them, if they start to understand what Laramie was talking about. Mason nodded grimly. The fog doesn't just take people, he said. It converts them. Turns them into willing participants. Makes them want to disappear. We gathered every tape that mentioned unusual sightings, strange voices, or unexplained phenomena. 17 cassettes in total, spanning 4 decades of fire watch duty at Timberline Ridge. 17 windows into the slow corruption of rational minds by something that lived in the spaces between sanity and madness. We burned them that night in the station's incinerator, watching decades of evidence melt into black plastic smoke. But even as the flames consumed the tapes, I could swear I heard Laramie's voice one last time, drifting up from the fire like a prayer or a warning. Join the silence. I returned for one last night at the tower 3 days later. Don't ask me why. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain the compulsion that drove me back up that mountain. Closure, maybe. Or maybe I knew that if I didn't go back, part of me would always stay trapped there anyway, wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough or stupid enough to face it one more time. Mason tried to talk me out of it. Hell, he tried to physically stop me, grabbing my arm as I loaded gear into the snowcat. You heard the tapes, he said, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. You know what happens to people who go back. This is exactly how it starts. The pull, the need to return, the certainty that you can handle whatever's waiting for you up there. But I shook him off. I'm not Laramie, I told him. I'm not going to walk into the fog and disappear. I just need to see it one more time, to prove to myself that it's real. Proving it's real is the first step toward joining it, Mason warned. The moment you accept that it exists, you start trying to understand it. And understanding it is what gets you killed. Maybe he was right. Probably he was right. But I went anyway. I took everything I could think of that might help. Salt, iron filings, crosses from 3 different denominations, a bag of blessed earth from St. Catherine's downtown, garlic, silver bullets for the emergency pistol I wasn't supposed to have. Anything that folklore claimed might ward off supernatural entities. I even brought Bruno, the retired search dog from the station. He was getting old, gray around the muzzle and slower than he used to be, but his nose was still sharp and his instincts were still solid. If anything was lurking around the tower, he'd know. Bruno made it exactly to the base of the tower before he sat down and refused to go any further. No amount of coaxing, no treats, no commands could make him climb those stairs. He just sat there in the snow, whimpering and staring up at the observation deck with eyes that reflected too much intelligence. You feel it too, don't you, boy? I asked, scratching behind his ears. His fur was standing on end, every muscle in his body tense with barely controlled panic. I tied his leash to one of the tower's support beams and climbed alone. The tower felt different that night. The air was thicker, charged with potential energy like the moments before a thunderstorm. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of floorboards, the whistle of wind through the windows, the steady tick of the clock on the wall marking time until something happened. I arranged my protective items in a circle around the room, sprinkling salt along the windowsills and door frames, hanging crosses from the corners, placing iron anywhere I thought it might do some good. Probably none of it would work, but the ritual of preparation was calming. It gave me something to do with my hands while my mind raced through possibilities. The fog rolled in just after midnight, thicker than I'd ever seen it. From the observation deck, the world simply ceased to exist beyond a radius of maybe 10 feet. Everything else was white void, a blank canvas waiting for something to paint itself across the emptiness. I checked my watch, 12:47 a.m. At exactly 1 a.m., I saw it again. It stepped out of the fog like it was emerging from another dimension, fully visible for the first time since this whole nightmare began. The sight of it hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the window frame to keep from falling. It was even worse than I'd imagined. Over 8 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in directions that hurt to follow with your eyes. Its skin, if you could call it skin, was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over a frame that looked like it had been assembled by someone who'd heard a description of human anatomy but never actually seen a person. But it was the face that nearly broke my sanity. Where features should have been was a smooth expanse broken only by that horizontal slit I'd glimpsed before, a mouth that was far too wide, revealing depths that seemed to go back further than the skull should allow. No eyes, no nose, just that terrible gash that might have been smiling if smiles could convey such alien intelligence. It didn't walk. It glided across the snow without leaving prints, moving with the fluid grace of something that existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. Around it, the fog swirled in patterns that were too regular to be natural, forming spirals and geometric shapes that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. It circled the tower once, moving with deliberate slowness, and then looked straight up at me. I didn't move. Couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up with primal terror, the kind of fear that bypasses rational thought and goes straight to the brainstem. This was what our ancestors felt when they huddled around fires and listened to things moving in the darkness beyond the light. And then it did something new. It spoke. Not out loud. Not with that obscene mouth. But I heard it anyway, the words appearing in my mind like someone was carving them directly into my brain tissue. You watched too long. You belong now. The voice was everything and nothing, male and female, young and old, human and utterly alien. It resonated in my bones, made my teeth ache, sent vibrations through my skull that I could feel in my sinuses. Come down. Join the silence. We have been waiting. The lights in the tower flickered and died, plunging me into darkness broken only by the pale glow of the fog pressing against the windows. The air turned solid, thick as water, making each breath a conscious effort. I felt like I was drowning in atmosphere. You have seen too much to remain as you are. The choice is made. Come willingly or be taken. Something was happening to my mind. The edges of my vision were growing soft, unfocused, as if reality itself was becoming negotiable. I could feel my grip on rational thought loosening, slipping away like water through cupped hands. The fog began to seep through the windows, not through openings, but through the glass itself, flowing like liquid light into the room. Where it touched my protective barriers, they simply disappeared. The salt evaporated. The iron crumbled to rust. The crosses blackened and fell from their nails. You cannot ward against that which invited you in. Your watching was consent. Your return was acceptance. Now come. The presence was inside the tower now, filling every corner with alien intelligence. I could feel it examining me, cataloging my fears and desires and memories, understanding me in ways I'd never understood myself. And the terrible thing was, part of me wanted to surrender. The voice was right about one thing. I had been watching too long. Night after night, staring into the fog, waiting for something to happen. And maybe, in some deep part of my psyche, I didn't want to acknowledge. I've been hoping it would find me. The isolation, the silence, the endless watching, it had changed me, made me into something that was no longer entirely human. Something that could commune with entities that lived in the spaces between spaces. Yes, the voice whispered, sensing my wavering resolve. You understand now. The watchers become the watched. The guardians become the guarded. Come and see what lies beyond the fog. I took a step toward the window. Then another. The fog reached out to me like welcoming arms, and I could see shapes moving within it. Tall figures that might once have been human, walking in procession through the white void. Laramie was there, and Jonathan Greer, and others I didn't recognize but somehow knew had once stood where I was standing, faced with the same impossible choice. They looked peaceful, content, like people who had finally found the place they belonged. Join us, they seemed to say, though their mouths never moved. Join the silence. I reached for the window latch. And then Bruno started barking. The sound cut through the fog-induced trance like a knife, sharp and real and completely, utterly mundane. A dog barking at something that scared him, the most normal sound in the world. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, shaking my head to clear the alien thoughts that had been seeping into my consciousness. The fog recoiled as if struck, withdrawing through the windows like it was being sucked back into whatever dimension it had emerged from. No. The voice was furious now, frustrated by my resistance. You cannot deny what you have become. You have seen. You have watched. You belong to the silence now. But I was already moving, grabbing my gear, heading for the stairs. Bruno's barking grew more frantic as I descended, and I could hear him thrashing against his leash, desperate to flee. I untied him with shaking hands, and we ran together into the forest, leaving the tower and its alien visitor behind. We didn't stop running until we reached the snowcat, and we didn't stop driving until we hit the main road. Behind us, the fog swirled around the abandoned tower like a living thing, and I could swear I heard voices calling my name. Not just one voice now, but many, all the watchers who had come before, all the souls that belonged to the silence. But I didn't look back. I couldn't look back, because I knew that if I did, I'd see something looking back at me. And this time, I might not be strong enough to resist its call. I transferred after that, moved to flatlands where the horizon stretched unbroken to the edges of the world, and there was nowhere for fog to hide. Open skies, endless visibility, the kind of country where you can see trouble coming from miles away. I got a job with the state parks department doing maintenance work, fixing trails, painting shelters, cleaning restrooms. Simple, honest work that kept my hands busy and my mind focused on concrete, solvable problems. No watching, no towers, no long nights staring into empty wilderness waiting for something to stare back. But the thing about encounters with impossible is that they change you in ways you don't always recognize at first. The changes come slowly, subtly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. I started noticing the silence first. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet, the way it seemed to pool in corners and gather in empty rooms. Normal silence that should have been comforting became threatening, pregnant with possibility. I found myself filling my house with noise, TV always on, radio playing in the background, anything to keep the quiet from settling too deeply. Then came the fog. Even normal fog, the kind that rolls in from the coast on summer mornings, made my skin crawl. I'd see it creeping across the fields, and my heart would start racing, my palms would start sweating, and I'd have to go inside and close all the blinds until it passed. But sometimes I swear the fog is different here. Thicker in places where it shouldn't be. More purposeful in its movements. Like it's looking for something. Like it's looking for me. And sometimes, when the fog is particularly heavy and the silence particularly deep, I hear footsteps. Not outside. That would be too easy, too explicable. Inside my house. Slow, deliberate steps moving through rooms I'm not in, circling closer with each pass. When I go to investigate, there's nothing there. But the footprints in the dust tell a different story, bare feet, impossibly long, leaving traces of that same oily red substance I found at the base of the tower. The worst part is the dreams. Every night, I find myself back in that tower, staring out into fog that swirls with alien intelligence. And every night, the voice is there, patient and persistent and utterly certain of its eventual victory. You cannot escape what you have become, it tells me. Distance is meaningless. Time is irrelevant. You have been marked, claimed, chosen. The silence will have you eventually. Sometimes I wake up standing at my bedroom window, hand pressed against the glass, staring out into empty fields that look suspiciously like the view from Timberline Ridge. Sometimes there are words written in the condensation, not English words, but symbols that hurt to look at and seem to rearrange themselves when I'm not watching directly. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants beyond the obvious. But I know this, Timberline doesn't just watch. It waits. It follows. It marks those who've seen too much and never lets them go completely. And once you've been seen by something that exists in the spaces between spaces, once you've heard the voice that speaks without speaking and felt the pull of the silence that isn't empty, you're never really alone again. Mason was right about one thing: the watchers become the watched. And I suspect that somewhere in the fog-shrouded peaks of Timberline Ridge, there's still a tower where rangers stand their lonely vigils, staring out into the white void and waiting for something to stare back. If you ever find yourself in a remote park tower, watching the mist roll in across miles of wilderness, Remember this. Don't stare too long into the fog, because it might be staring back. And once it sees you seeing it, the watching never stops. There's a place in our park map we're not allowed to talk about. The name's been scrubbed from the official charts. The signs are gone. The access trail's overgrown on purpose. But we all know it's still there, Devil's Hollow. I didn't believe the stories until the night I heard the whistle. It was past 2 a.m. Dead quiet except for the river. I was checking the eastern quadrant for illegal campers when I heard it echo through the valley, one long warbling note. Too perfect to be wind. Too precise to be random. I thought it was some kid with a flute, but then I heard it again. Only closer. The sound seemed to bend reality around it, making the darkness thicker, the silence more oppressive. My radio crackled with static that formed patterns, almost like Morse code, but wrong somehow. The trees leaned in, their branches creaking in rhythm with that haunting melody. I called it in. Dispatch told me, quote, "Return immediately. Do not engage. Do not investigate." That's not something they ever say. In 15 years of ranger work, I'd never heard fear in Dispatch's voice before. But there it was, raw, unmistakable terror bleeding through the radio static. Of course, I didn't listen. And that's when everything started to go wrong. You see, the whistle isn't just a sound. It's an invitation. And once you've heard it, you don't get to ignore it anymore. Not unless you're willing to lose your mind or your soul. I first learned about Devil's Hollow during Ranger orientation. They didn't mention it officially. But after the day's lectures, an old lifer named Jenna pulled me aside. Her weathered hand shook as she lit a cigarette, the flame casting strange shadows across her lined face. "You ever patrol solo and hear music in the trees?" she asked, staring dead serious. "Turn around. Doesn't matter what you're chasing. Turn back." I laughed. She didn't. "People hear it before they disappear," she said. "They always hear the whistle first." She pulled out a manila folder, yellowed with age. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white images of empty campsites, abandoned vehicles, personal belongings scattered across forest floors. Each photo was marked with a date and a single word, Whistler. 37 confirmed disappearances in the last 50 years, Jenna whispered. All in the same area. All after reporting strange music in the night. I thought it was just campfire nonsense. But as I settled into the job, I noticed strange things around the hollow's perimeter. Weather acted up fast. Sunny mornings would turn to impenetrable fog within minutes when approaching the restricted zone. Animals avoided it. Deer trails curve away in impossible arcs, as if something invisible pushed them back. Birds never flew overhead. Even insects seemed to die mid-flight at the boundary. Radios glitched out for no reason. Not just static, they would pick up fragments of conversations from years past, voices of rangers long retired or dead, reporting incidents that never made it into official records. And the air. It was heavier there, like walking into a pressure chamber. Your ears would pop. Your vision would blur. Some rangers reported nosebleeds that wouldn't stop until they retreated beyond a ridge. One day, I caught a glimpse of the old trail marker. Half buried in the grass, almost completely overtaken by thorny vines that seemed to grow in spirals around a rotting wood. Carved into it was a crude warning. He whistles for the lost. Stay above the ridge. Below that, scratched in fresher cuts, they never stop listening. And below that, in what looked like dried blood, it's in the song. I didn't take it seriously until my 3rd week on solo patrol. The night everything changed, I found a logbook hidden in a hollow tree near the marker. The entries spanned decades, written in different hands. 1987, heard the music again. Johnson says ignore it. Can't sleep. 1993, found Margaret's badge near the old campsite. She's been missing 2 weeks. The whistle led me there. 2001, it's not random. The pattern repeats every 19 days. New moon. Always new moon. 2015. I understand now. The song isn't coming from the hollow. It's coming from underneath. The final entry was dated just 3 days before I found it. My name is Ranger Susan Mills. If you're reading this, I've gone into the hollow. The whistle won't stop. It's in my dreams now. In my thoughts. I can feel it changing me from the inside. Don't look for me. Just burn this book and forget this place exists. It was a chilly October night. The kind where your breath hangs long in front of you and the forest sounds distant, muted. I was on foot, checking a stretch of trail near the eastern basin. The fog had rolled in thick, curling like fingers around the base of trees. But this fog was wrong. It moved against the wind, forming shapes that almost looked deliberate. Then I heard it. A single low whistle. Almost musical. It echoed in an unnatural way, like it bent toward me rather than away. The sound seemed to carry impossible distances, bouncing off trees that couldn't produce such resonance, lingering in the air long after it should have faded. I stopped, turned off my headlamp. Listened. Another whistle. Shorter this time. Closer. My skin prickled. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. My breath came out in sharp puffs, but the fog around me grew warmer, almost body temperature. It was like standing in the breath of something enormous and hidden. The fog seemed to twist with the sound, coiling like smoke from an invisible chimney. Shapes formed and dissolved, faces, hands, figures that beckoned before melting back into mist. I called dispatch. Control, this is Ranger Thompson, Eastern Quadrant. Do you copy? I'm hearing. Static. Then, leave. Just one word. Not in the dispatcher's voice. Not even a voice I recognized. It was deeper, older, like wind through a cave, like breath through a broken flute. Just leave. My stomach turned cold. The radio crackled again, and I heard what sounded like my own voice saying, "Don't listen. Don't answer. Don't follow." But I hadn't spoken. I tried the radio again. Dead silence. Even the static was gone. I shook it, checked the battery. Full power, full signal strength. But no sound would come through. That's when I noticed the silence around me had become absolute. No wind, no insects, no rustle of leaves. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My stomach turned cold. I did what I shouldn't have done. I moved toward the sound. Each step felt like walking through molasses. The air grew thicker, more resistant. My legs felt detached from my body, moving of their own accord. The whistle came again, and this time I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The trail ahead shimmered, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But it was October, and the temperature was dropping fast. Ice was forming on the trees, but the air around me felt tropical, humid, alive. As I walked deeper into the fog, I started to see lights. Not flashlights or campfires, but pale greenish glows that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. They pulsed in rhythm with the whistle, growing brighter as the melody grew stronger. And that's when I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't following the sound anymore. It was leading me. The trail ended at an old campsite long since abandoned. Rusted fire rings, scraps of nylon, a boot half buried in dirt. But something was wrong. The trees leaned inward, like they were listening, watching. Their branches had grown into unnatural curves, forming almost perfect spirals that seemed to focus on the center of the clearing. The bark was smooth in places, worn down as if countless hands had touched the same spots over and over. That's when I saw the carvings, hundreds of them, on bark, stone, even bones. All the same shape, crude horn, with spirals coming from it like sound waves. But looking closer, I realized they weren't just carvings. They were burned in, branded. And they were fresh, some still smoldering with an ember that never died. Scattered around a campsite were personal belongings that spanned decades. A compass from the 1960s, a digital camera from the 2000s, a smartphone with a cracked screen, still glowing with 12% battery life. Each item was arranged in careful circles around the fire rings, like offerings at an altar. I found a journal, mostly illegible from rain, but one page stuck. Day 6. Whistle came again. Dave followed it into the trees. Haven't seen him since. Can't sleep. I think I hear it in my dreams. The melody is changing me. It knows my thoughts before I think them. I think it's in me now. Growing. Learning. Soon I won't be me anymore. Soon I'll be part of the song. The handwriting deteriorated with each line, becoming more erratic, more desperate. The final words were scratched so deep they tore through the paper. It's not a whistle. It's a voice. And it's calling my name. I backed away, my heart hammering. That's when I saw movement. Someone, something, was standing just beyond the fire pit. Tall, wrapped in mist, wearing an old ranger uniform, but the patches were wrong, the badges from different decades, the fabric stitched together like a quilt of lost lives. But the face, it wasn't right. Too smooth, too blank, like clay molded wrong. Where eyes should be were hollow sockets that seemed to go deeper than they should. The mouth was just a thin line, but it stretched too wide, reaching almost to where ears should be. And then it lifted a whistle to its lips. Not a manufactured whistle, this was carved from bone, yellowed with age, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. When the thing raised it, I could see that its fingers were too long, jointed in too many places. The mist around us began to swirl faster, forming a perfect circle. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in violent puffs, but the thing in the uniform showed no signs of breathing at all. Before it blew, everything went black. But in that moment of darkness, I heard something that will haunt me forever. Not just one whistle, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all harmonizing in a melody that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. I woke in the dark. Underground. Dirt walls. No light. Just the sound of trickling water and distant music. Windy. Reedy. Wrong. The tunnel smelled of rotted moss and something older, decay that had been fermenting for centuries. The air was thick, almost chewy, with a metallic taste that coated my tongue and made my throat burn. I had my radio. It was fried, not just dead, but melted. The plastic had warped into spirals that matched the carvings from above. I had my flashlight. Dead. But when I shook it, I could hear something rattling inside. Something that shouldn't be there. I started crawling. My shoulders brushed the walls, and I could feel things embedded in the dirt. Not rocks, but shapes that yielded when pressed. Soft shapes. Familiar shapes. My knees scraped on bone. Lots of bone. The tunnel stretched on forever, branching into passages that seemed to follow no earthly logic. Some angled impossibly upward, defying gravity. Others descended so steeply I had to brace myself to avoid falling into darkness. Then of voices. Dozens. Whispering all at once. Where are you going? Stay. Stay with us. Listen. He's almost here. Join the song. It's beautiful down here. We've been waiting so long for someone new. The voices were coming from the walls themselves, seeping through the dirt like water through a sieve. When I pressed my ear to the ground, I could hear them more clearly, men, women, children, all speaking in perfect unison. He taught us the song. Now we sing forever. Now we are never alone. I screamed. No one answered except the whistle. High, long, sweet. And in my mind, I saw his face. Or rather, the lack of it. The sound was coming from ahead, growing stronger with each moment. But it wasn't just sound anymore. It was light pressing against my closed eyelids. It was heat warming the frigid tunnel. It was gravity, pulling me forward against my will. As I crawled toward the source, the voices grew more excited. New song, new song. He brings a new song. Listen how his heart beats. Listen how his breath shakes. Soon he will forget the old songs. Soon he will know only the true song. The tunnel walls began to glow with that same sickly green phosphorescence I'd seen in the fog. But now I could see what was embedded in the dirt, not just bones, but personal effects. Ranger badges, jewelry, photographs of families that would never see their loved ones again. And they were all humming. Every single object pulsed with that same haunting melody, as if the whistle had infected them, turned them into instruments in some vast underground orchestra. The tunnel ended in a cavern. It shouldn't have existed on the park map, but it was there, a hollowed-out chamber deep beneath the ridge, lit by a sickly green glow from fungal patches on the walls. It pulsed, almost breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with that eternal whistle. That's when I saw them. People, dozens, standing still in the darkness, arranged in perfect concentric circles around a central figure. Their eyes were wide open, but unfocused, staring at something beyond sight. Their mouths moved with no sound, lips forming words and languages I didn't recognize. Their bodies twitched with rhythm, like they were following an unseen conductor. But it was their clothes that made my blood freeze. Ranger uniforms spanning decades. Some wore patches from the 1950s, others from just last year. All perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped the moment they entered this place. At the center was him, the Whistler. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, back arched impossibly, spine curved like a question mark. He wore a stitched-together uniform made from Rangers past, not just their clothes, but pieces of them. Patches of skin formed the collar, hair woven into the fabric, fingers used as buttons. On his face was a mask made of bark and bone, but it was moving, breathing, as if it were part of him now. Through the eye holes, I could see not eyes but tunnels, passages that seemed to lead deeper into his skull than should be possible. In his hand, a whistle made of hollowed antler, but it was wrong, too long, too curved, with holes that formed patterns that made no sense. It looked grown rather than carved, as if some creature had evolved specifically to create that sound. When he blew it, no sound came. But I felt it, like a hook dragging through my mind, pulling thoughts I didn't want to think, dredging up memories I'd buried deep. The melody wrapped around my consciousness, squeezing until I could barely remember my own name. My knees buckled. Blood rushed from my ears, but instead of falling, it flowed upward, against gravity, toward the ceiling where it joined streams from the other captives. And then I heard the command. Walk. Not heard it, felt it. The word carved itself into my brain, overwrote my will, replaced my intentions with its own. I resisted, but my legs moved anyway. Step by step, I approached the circle. The other captives turned to watch me, their faces slack with a terrible contentment. One of them, a woman in a uniform from the 1980s, smiled at me with teeth that had grown into perfect spirals. "Welcome," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you. The song isn't complete without you." I was joining this circle, joining this song, and I realized what the journal meant. It's in me now. The whistle doesn't just summon. It changes you, from the inside out. As I took my place among the lost, I felt my thoughts beginning to harmonize with theirs. My heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of the chamber. My breathing matched the pulse of the fungal lights. The Whistler raised his instrument again, and this time I understood what he was really doing. He wasn't making music. He was rewriting souls. I don't remember how long I stood there, entranced. Time worked differently in that place. Minutes felt like hours, but hours passed like seconds. I could feel my memories being edited, my personality being smoothed away like rough edges on a stone. Soon, I would be like the others, perfect, peaceful, empty. But something broke the spell. A sound, real, earthly, wrong in this place of eternal melody. dog bark. Sharp, urgent, breaking through the hypnotic harmony like a gunshot through silk. The sound was so alien in this chamber of whispers that it shocked my system back to awareness. Then flashlights, voices. Search team, East Quadrant. We found a breach. The spell shattered like glass. My consciousness snapped back into my own skull, and suddenly I could think clearly again. The other captives wavered, their perfect formation disrupted. Some collapsed. Others began to scream, not in harmony, but in individual voices, each expressing their own terror and confusion. The Whistler turned. So did the others. The mask of bark and bone cracked down the middle, revealing what lay beneath, not a face, but a void. A hungry emptiness that had been feeding on stolen songs for decades, growing stronger with each new voice added to its choir. It raised the whistle to its non-lips, and for the first time, I heard its true voice, not the melodic call that had lured me here, but a shriek of pure rage and hunger. The sound was so loud it made the cavern walls crack. Chunks of stone rained down. I ran. I shoved through the dazed figures, their hands grabbing at me with desperate need. "Don't leave us," they pleaded. "The song isn't finished. We need you to complete the harmony." But I was already moving, muscle memory taking over. I dove toward the tunnel entrance just as the chamber began to collapse. The Whistler's scream followed me, a sound like tearing metal and breaking bones. I crawled up the narrow tunnel, dirt raining down on my back. Behind me, the whistle shrieked, finally audible, and it wasn't music anymore. It was rage. It was hunger. It was the sound of something ancient and terrible being denied its prey. The cavern trembled. The tunnel began to collapse, chunks of earth and stone tumbling around me. I could hear the other captives behind me, some trying to follow, others remaining loyal to their master, all of them screaming in voices they'd almost forgotten they had. A ranger's hand reached in, grabbed mine. "Move," they shouted. We scrambled out just as the ground caved in behind me. I felt fingers brush my ankle, one of the lost trying to drag me back, but then the tunnel sealed completely. The hollow sealed itself, but not entirely. Because as we pulled away from the collapsed entrance, I could still hear it, muffled now, but persistent. The whistle, calling from beneath tons of earth and stone. And I realized with growing horror that burying it hadn't destroyed it. It had only made it angry. And I'm not the same anymore. The melody is still in my head, playing softly in the background of every thought. Sometimes, when it's very quiet, I catch myself humming along. They found me 3 miles from where I should have been, covered in dirt that didn't match the local soil composition. My fingernails were torn and bloody from clawing through earth. My uniform was shredded, but not by thorns or rocks, by desperate hands trying to pull me back into the dark. My report was filed, redacted, buried. My supervisors called it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. They cited my clean psychological evaluation, my exemplary service record, my complete lack of prior incidents. But they didn't explain the footage. One of the rescue team's helmet cams captured 7 seconds of audio in the tunnel before it collapsed. 7 seconds of what experts described as a flute made from organic material. But analysis revealed something impossible. The sound contained frequencies that human instruments cannot produce. Subsonic tones that triggered fight-or-flight responses. Ultrasonic harmonics that bypass conscious hearing and speak directly to the amygdala. The acoustic engineer who analyzed the recording submitted his resignation the next day. In his final report, he wrote, "This is not music. This is a predator's call, evolved over centuries to mimic human communication. Whatever made this sound learned to speak by listening to its prey. No one's seen that team member since. I took medical leave. Haven't gone back. But others did." New rangers were assigned to the Eastern Quadrant. Within a month, 3 had reported strange sounds near the collapsed entrance. Within 2 months, 1 had gone missing. They found his radio, his equipment, his boots, all arranged in a perfect circle around a patch of ground that had mysteriously softened, as if something underneath was trying to dig its way out. I get emails from rangers across the country now. Unofficial ones, sent from personal accounts, encrypted and anonymous. They've heard the same whistle in different forests. Always at night. Always in fog. Always followed by missing persons reports. The pattern is spreading. Park services in 12 states have reported similar incidents. Always the same, a musical call in the wilderness, followed by disappearances. Always the same aftermath, collapsed tunnels, abandoned campsites, personal belongings arranged in spiral patterns. The hollow might be gone, but the whistler isn't trapped. He's moving, learning, adapting, and he's teaching others to sing his song. I have one rule now. Never follow the music. Doesn't matter what you think you hear, a melody in the wind, a tune between trees, a low whistle behind your tent at night. If you follow it, you won't come back the same. And if you work alone, especially in remote areas, be on guard. The whistler feeds on solitude, on doubt, on the kind of silence that stretches long enough to turn into sound. He's patient. He's clever. And he's learning from every encounter. The original Devil's Hollow was just his first home. Now he builds new ones, deeper and more complex. The songs are evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more irresistible. He's not just copying human music anymore. He's improving it, perfecting it, turning it into something that speaks directly to the parts of our minds we can't control. To this day, I sleep with a fan running. I keep white noise machines in every room. I've soundproofed my apartment, installed noise-canceling windows, covered every surface with materials that absorb rather than reflect sound. Because when the house gets too quiet, I hear it. Not always, but often enough. That single note, calling me back. And each time it comes, it's a little clearer, a little more beautiful, a little harder to resist. Sometimes I catch myself walking toward the window before I realize what I'm doing. Sometimes I wake up with my hand on the doorknob, keys in my other hand, dressed and ready to drive back to the mountains. He's still there, still singing, still waiting. And I know that someday, when I'm tired or weak or just tired of fighting, I'll answer. I'll follow the music home. If you ever hear it, if the wind sings and the forest listens, don't answer. You don't want to end up part of the song. But if you do hear it, if you feel that irresistible pull toward the darkness, remember this. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But you might be the one who finally breaks the cycle. Because somewhere, in the deepest part of the earth, an ancient thing is teaching new voices to sing. And the harmony is growing stronger every day. I've served as a park ranger in Glacier Peak Reserve for nearly 19 years. Seen all black bear attacks, lost campers, blizzards that rip tents to ribbons. I've pulled hypothermic hikers from snow caves, tracked wounded elk through mile-deep ravines, and spent countless nights alone in the wilderness with nothing but my radio and the sound of my own breathing. The mountains don't scare me. Animals don't scare me. Weather doesn't scare me. But I only tell the story to people I think might listen. Not believe, listen. Because what I'm about to share isn't in our ranger manual. It's not on the map. And if you ask HQ about it, they'll either hang up or tell you you're crazy. Hell, they might even recommend you for psychological evaluation. I know because I tried. 3 times. Each time, they looked at me like I'd lost my grip on reality. But I saw it. I heard it. And I barely got away with my life. It started with a call about a missing solo hiker. Woman in her 30s, registered as Sarah Chin on the backcountry permit. Experienced hiker, according to her records, had permits for Yellowstone, Denali, the works. No emergency beacon, no satellite ping. The only clue we had was something another camper reported hearing the night she vanished. They said they heard whistling in the trees. Low, melodic, almost playful. Like someone calling a dog. But it went on for hours, they said. Same 3 notes over and over. echoing through the pines until it seemed to come from every direction at once. And then a woman's voice whispering, "Don't follow him." The reporting camper was a geology professor from Portland, not the type to make things up. When I interviewed him, his hand shook as he poured coffee from his camp stove. Said he'd packed up and hiked out in the dark, didn't care about the bears or the cliffs. Whatever he heard in those woods terrified him more than anything nature could throw at him. We searched 2 days before I stumbled into the clearing where she'd last set up camp. Her tent was there, zipped tight. Her boots placed neatly outside the entrance like she just stepped out for a moment. Her backpack untouched, with 3 days of food still inside and her water bottles full. But no footprints leading away. Only one set of prints coming in. Her boot treads were clear in the soft earth around the campsite, but they just stopped, like she'd been plucked straight up into the sky. I circled that camp 3 times, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. Nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth, no blood, no struggle. And just before I radioed it in, I heard the whistling too. 3 notes, over and over. Low, high, low. Almost like it was calling for someone. The sound seemed to drift through the trees, impossible to pinpoint. First from the north, then the west, then right behind me. My skin crawled as I realized I was hearing the same melody the camper had described. The same 3 notes that had played the night Sarah Chin disappeared. I should have left then. Should have called for backup, marked the GPS coordinates, and gotten the hell out of those woods. But instead, I stepped forward. And that's when the forest changed. The air turned heavy. Still, like everything around me was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Even the birds had gone silent. In 19 years of ranging, I never experienced such complete quiet in the wilderness. No chirping, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I scanned the tree lean, whispering into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Elias." At the site, tents intact. No sign of the subject. But I think I hear something. Static crackled back at me, harsh and metallic in the unnatural quiet. No answer. Just static. Then the whistling again. Closer now. Much closer. 3 notes, low, a high, low. The melody seemed to hang in the air, lingering longer than any natural sound should. I pulled my revolver, standard issue, and edged toward the sound, my boots crunching softly on fallen pine needles. Each step felt wrong, like I was walking deeper into something I wasn't meant to see. The trees around me were massive ponderosa pines, some easily over 100 feet tall. But now they seemed different. Wrong somehow. Their branches hung lower, creating a canopy so thick that barely any sunlight filtered through. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. No movement. But the trees seemed taller. Leaning toward me, their massive trunks tilting at impossible angles, creating a tunnel effect that led deeper into the forest. The bark looked darker too, almost black in places, with strange patterns that reminded me of faces. That's when I saw the marks. Long, deep gouges carve into the bark of 5 or 6 pines in a perfect line, as if something massive had dragged claws through them while walking upright. The gouges were fresh, pale wood showed through where the bark had been stripped away. But they were too high up, at least 8 feet off the ground. And they were too wide. Whatever made these marks had claws the size of railroad spikes. I followed the line of marked trees, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The gouges led to a clearing I hadn't noticed before, where all the trees formed a perfect circle around a strange mound in the center. The mound was too symmetrical for a natural formation. Dirt covered in moss, shaped like a grave. About 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, with the moss growing in patterns that almost looked like writing in a language I didn't recognize. The earth was darker here, rich and black, as if something had been feeding it. And then the whistling stopped. The silence pressed in like a vice, so complete I could hear my own blood rushing through my veins. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the trees in a way that made no sense. I turned around to head back and found that the path I'd come from was gone. Not overgrown, not hidden, not obscured by fallen branches or shifting shadows. Just gone. Where moments before there had been a clear trail marked by broken twigs and my own footprints, now there was only solid wall of trees. Ancient pines pressed together so tightly their branches intertwined, creating an impenetrable barrier. The forest floor between them was covered in thorny undergrowth that hadn't been there before. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My GPS device showed nothing but static. Even my watch had stopped, the second hand frozen between 2 and 3. The woods weren't the same anymore. Something had changed the moment I stepped into that clearing, like I'd crossed an invisible threshold into a place that followed different rules. The air tasted different, metallic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of decay. Every breath felt thick, almost solid, like I was drowning in honey. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible, I heard the whistling start again. I marked a tree with my knife, carving a deep X into the bark, and walked 20 feet in what I thought was the direction I'd come from. The undergrowth seemed to part for me, branches bending away as I passed. Did it again at the next tree, another deep X, the blade biting through bark and into pale wood. Came back the same way, following my own footprints in the soft earth, retracing my exact steps. The first tree was gone. Only the second one remained, now covered in frost despite the mild October weather. Ice crystals clung to the bark around my fresh carving, and when I touched the tree, the cold burned my fingertips. My breath came out in visible puffs, though moments before the air had been warm. The temperature dropped sharply, and I saw my breath fog in front of me in thick white clouds. Frost began forming on the surrounding vegetation, turning green leaves silver and making the pine needles brittle. The change happened so fast I could actually watch the ice spreading from tree to tree like a living thing. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a figure, pale and thin, darting between the trees with unnatural speed. Too tall to be human, moving with a jerky, puppet-like gait that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and cold. Hey, hey. No answer. Not even an echo. My voice seemed to die the moment it left my mouth, swallowed by the frozen air. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. Then the whistling started again. But this time it was behind me. 3 notes, low, high, low, but distorted now, like it was coming through water or from very far away. I spun around, nearly losing my footing on the frost-slick ground, but no one was there. Only my reflection, in a standing pool of water I hadn't noticed before. The pool was perfectly circular, about 6 feet across, with water so still it looked like black glass. It shouldn't have been there. The ground had been solid pine needles and earth moments before. But there it was, reflecting the canopy above and the gray sky beyond. I stepped closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. The water was impossibly clear despite its dark appearance. I could see every detail of my reflection, my ranger uniform, my wide eyes, the stubble on my chin, even the small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. And my reflection smiled before I did. A slow spreading grin that revealed teeth too sharp and too numerous. The reflection's eyes remained fixed on mine even as I stepped back in horror, its head turning to follow my movement in a way that made no physical sense. Then the reflection mouthed words, its lips moving in perfect silence. You looked too long. I backed away from the impossible pool. Fast. My boots slipped on the frost-covered ground, and I nearly fell as I stumbled backward into the trees. The reflection in the water continued to smile, but now it was pointing at something behind me. Slowly, deliberately, with one pale finger extended toward the woods at my back. Suddenly, I heard her voice, the missing hiker, Sarah Chen, whispering directly into my right ear, so close I could feel breath that wasn't there. He whistles to lure. He mimics to trap. Don't follow him. Her voice was hollow, echoing, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. But the words were crystal clear, spoken with desperate urgency. Spinning in place, my revolver raised, I saw no one. Just the trees and my reflection, still smiling on its own, still pointing. The pointing reflection's mouth moved again. She tried to warn you too. The wind picked up, carrying a foul stench, wet dog fur and rotting leaves, mixed with something else. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water, so overwhelming I had to fight not to vomit. And then I heard movement again. But this time, it didn't try to hide. Branches snapped. Heavy footsteps crunched through fallen leaves. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was coming directly toward me. A tall figure stepped out from behind a massive pine, moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait I'd glimpsed before. His limbs were long, too long, arms that hung nearly to his knees, fingers that looked more like pale branches than human appendages. His legs were similarly elongated, bending at angles that suggested too many joints. Face pale as birch bark, mouth split ear to ear in an unnatural grin that revealed rows and rows of needle-sharp teeth. His eyes were completely black, like holes punched through paper, reflecting nothing. But the most disturbing thing was how he moved. Not like he was walking, but like he was being puppeted by invisible strings, his limbs jerking and swaying in ways that defied anatomy. He raised one bony finger, longer than any human finger should be, with too many knuckles, and pressed it to his lips. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and multiplying until it became a rushing whisper that filled my ears. Then he started whistling. Low, high, low. The same three notes, but now I could see where they came from. His impossible mouth stretched in that horrific grin, somehow producing the melody without changing shape. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely and vibrate directly in my bones. I ran. My legs moved before my brain caught up, carrying me away from that grinning nightmare and deeper into the frozen woods. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, not running, but walking with measured pace, as if he knew exactly where I was going and wasn't worried about losing me. The whistling followed, growing louder instead of fainter as I fled. The woods warped as I sprinted, my lungs burning in the frigid air. Branches bent toward me like grasping fingers, their frost-covered tips scraping against my jacket and face. Roots grabbed at my boots, sending me stumbling and nearly falling with every few steps. The trees themselves seemed to shift and move, creating new paths that led deeper into the forest while closing off any route that might lead back to safety. The canopy above grew thicker, blocking out more and more of the gray sky until I was running through near total darkness. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I ran, illuminating twisted tree trunks and ice-covered undergrowth that looked like the remains of some ancient battle. Everything was wrong. Pine trees growing next to species that shouldn't exist in this climate, flowers blooming out of season, their petals black with frost. Then, in a clearing that opened suddenly before me, I found something that stopped me cold. A massive tree, easily 20 feet in diameter, hollowed out and glowing faintly from within. The hollow was perfectly round, as if carved by expert hands rather than formed by natural decay. Soft, phosphorescent light emanated from inside, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. I stepped closer, drawn by the light and by something else, a sound coming from within the hollow. Whispers echoed from inside, dozens of voices speaking in hushed, desperate tones. Help me. Can't get out. Been here so long. Please, someone help us. And there, clearer than the rest, Sarah Chen's voice. Don't come closer. Don't look. Please, just run. But I couldn't run. My feet moved forward as if controlled by someone else, carrying me toward the impossible tree despite every instinct screaming at me to flee. I raised my flashlight, the beam joining with the strange internal glow. Inside the hollow tree, the walls were lined with faces, dozens of them, half sunk into the wood like they were drowning in solid matter. Their eyes were open and pleading, mouths moving in silent screams or whispered prayers. Some looked fresh, their features still clear and human. Others were more tree than person, bark growing over their faces like a slow-spreading disease. Frozen, trapped, becoming part of the tree itself. She was among them, Sarah Chin, her face half swallowed by bark, dark hair tangled with twigs and moss, mouth open in silent scream. But her eyes were aware, conscious. She saw me looking and tried to speak, her lips forming words I couldn't hear. Help me. The other faces turned toward me, dozens of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Men, women, children, hikers, and campers from across the decades, maybe longer. All trapped in the living wood, slowly being consumed while remaining horribly aware. Then I heard his footsteps behind me, slow, barefoot despite the frost-covered ground, crunching leaves with deliberate, measured steps. I turned. He was closer now, having somehow crossed the clearing without making a sound until this moment. The whistling man stood barely 10 feet away, his impossible grin wider than before, black eyes fixed on mine. Still grinning, still whistling those 3 haunting notes. But now he was whispering too. His voice came from everywhere at once, surrounding me like a living thing. You look too long. You listen too long. You're already mine. As he spoke, I felt something happening to my feet. Looking down, I saw thin roots emerging from the ground, wrapping around my boots, holding me in place. The same phosphorescent glow began to emanate from my skin. The tree was calling to me. The hollow was growing larger, making room for one more face in its horrible collection. With strength born of pure terror, I tore my feet free from the grasping roots and plunged back into the forest, panic choking my throat like a physical thing. The whistling man's laughter followed me, not the 3-note whistle now, but actual laughter, high and musical and completely inhuman. Every tree looked the same in the darkness, massive pines with frost-covered branches that seemed to reach for me as I passed. My GPS was spinning wildly, showing impossible readings, coordinates that placed me simultaneously in 3 different states, altitudes that would put me underwater or floating in the sky. My compass needle was going completely wild, jerking in circles so fast it was just a blur of metal. North, south, east, west, the directions had lost all meaning in this place that existed outside normal geography. Time lost meaning, too. Minutes felt like hours. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop running. My flashlight flickered ominously, the beam growing weaker and more yellow with each passing moment. I had spare batteries in my pack, but I was afraid to stop long enough to change them. The whistling followed me through the trees, sometimes distant, sometimes so close I could feel it vibrating in my chest. And underneath the melody, I began to hear other sounds, the voices of all those trapped faces, calling out in languages I didn't recognize, pleading for help that would never come. Suddenly, I found myself back at the same campsite, the one where this started, where Sarah Chin had pitched her tent before vanishing into this nightmare. Except now, the tent was burned to ash. The clearing was exactly as I remembered it, down to the placement of rocks around the old fire ring. But where the tent had been, only a pile of gray ash remained, still smoldering despite the frost that covered everything else. The smell of burned nylon and melted aluminum filled the air. A shadow moved inside the flames, impossible, since there were no flames, only glowing embers and ash. But I could see it clearly, a tall silhouette dancing in fire that wasn't there. The whistling man stood there, still, watching. His black eyes reflected the non-existent flames, and his grin had grown even wider, stretching his face into something that was no longer even vaguely human. Then he stepped into the fire, into the ash pile where the tent had been. And the flames went out, all at once. Even the glowing embers died, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. My flashlight chose that moment to die completely, leaving me blind in the frozen woods with only the sound of my own panicked breathing and racing heart. Only his whistle remained in the darkness. Low, high, low. The three notes echoed from every direction, growing louder and more distorted, multiplying and overlapping until it sounded like a chorus of the damned. Then a nothing. Complete silence. Complete darkness. I felt something cold touch my face, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When awareness returned, it came slowly, like surfacing from deep water. First, the cold, bone deep and unrelenting, seeping through my clothes and into my very core. Then pain in my head, sharp and throbbing. Finally, the realization that I was lying on something soft and damp. I opened my eyes to find myself lying in a mossy circle surrounded by standing stones. They weren't natural formations, these were carved megaliths, each one easily 12 feet tall and covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stones were ancient, far older than anything that should exist in these woods. Older than the indigenous settlements, older than European exploration, older than human presence in North America at all. They predated history, emanating an aura of immense age and malevolent purpose. It looked like a ritual circle, something constructed for ceremonies I didn't want to imagine. The moss beneath me was soft and thick, but it was growing in patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at too closely. Something sat across from me in the circle. Not him, not the whistling man, but Saracen. She was free, no longer trapped in the hollow tree, no longer half consumed by bark and wood. Flesh and blood again, wearing the same hiking clothes she disappeared in. But her eyes held depths of horror that no human should ever have to carry. She was crying, tears streaming down her face in steady rivulets. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. I traded my voice for freedom, she said, each word an obvious struggle. He offered me a choice. Stay trapped in the tree forever, conscious and aware as I slowly became part of it, or give him something precious in exchange for release. Her hand went to her throat, where I could now see a thin line of scar tissue running from ear to ear. I thought he meant my voice literally, but he meant more than that. He took my ability to warn people, to tell them about this place. Every time I try to speak about what happened here, the words turned to dust in my mouth. She looked at me with eyes full of desperate apology. Now he wants yours. Before I could respond, before I could ask what she meant, he stepped between us. The whistling man materialized from the shadows between the standing stones, moving with that same jerky, puppet-like gait. But he was different now, more solid, more real, as if my presence here had given him greater substance. He held out a thin, branch-like finger, bark-textured and ending in a nail like a curved thorn. Pressed it to my throat. The touch was ice-cold and electric, sending waves of numbness through my entire body. I tried to scream, tried to speak, tried to make any sound at all. Silence. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. My vocal cords felt frozen, paralyzed by whatever power flowed through his touch. But I could still hear Sarah whispering urgently, "The trade isn't final until you accept it. Fight it. Don't let him take what makes you human." The whistling man's grin widened impossibly, and he began to whistle that damned three-note melody directly into my face. But now I could hear words underneath the tune, forming in my mind without passing through my ears. Your voice for your freedom. Your warnings for your life. Choose quickly, Ranger. The tree is hungry, and there are worse fates than being consumed. Sarah grabbed my hand. Her fingers were ice-cold but reassuringly real, and ran. The forest blurred past in a chaos of frost-covered branches and twisted shadows. My legs moved without conscious thought, following her lead as she navigated between the standing stones and back into the woods. Behind us, I could hear the whistling man's laughter, not pursuing but not concerned either. He knew something we didn't, some truth about this trade that made our escape irrelevant. The forest began to change around us, the trees growing less twisted, the air growing warmer. Normal sounds returned, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through normal pine needles. And suddenly, we were out. We stumbled into Ranger HQ at dawn, our clothes torn and frost-covered, our faces haggard with exhaustion and terror. The morning sun felt like a blessing after the endless night in those cursed woods. My supervisor, Tom Martinez, nearly passed out when he saw us stagger through the door. He'd been coordinating search efforts from the main desk, surrounded by maps and radio equipment, coffee cups and energy drink cans marking the passage of his sleepless vigil. Jesus Christ, Elias, you've been missing for 5 days. We sent search teams into those woods, choppers, dogs, the whole 9 yards. Found nothing. Not a single trace. 5 days. I looked at my watch, still stopped between 2 and 3, then at the wall clock. Tuesday morning. I'd entered those woods on Thursday afternoon. Somehow one endless night had stretched into nearly a week. The woman, I croaked, then realized with growing horror that my voice was little more than a whisper. Saracen. She needs medical attention. The hiker collapsed as I spoke, her legs finally giving out after whatever ordeal had kept her moving through the forest. The paramedics were called, and she was taken to County General within the hour. But I couldn't speak properly. Not just whispers. When I tried to tell anyone what had happened in the woods, the words would die in my throat. I could discuss other things normally, but anything related to the whistling man, the hollow tree, the standing stones, it was like trying to speak through molasses. Medical exams showed no damage to my vocal cords. No physical trauma, no signs of injury or disease. The doctors ran every test they could think of, MRIs, blood work, neurological evaluations. Everything came back normal. I just couldn't speak about what mattered most. They retired me on medical leave within the month. Traumatic stress reaction, they called it. Psychological selective mutism brought on by extreme psychological trauma. They recommended therapy, medication, extended rest. But I still hear the whistle. Every night without fail, just as I'm drifting off to sleep. Low, high, low. Sometimes outside the window, drifting through the darkness like it's carried on impossible winds. Sometimes from the woods behind my house, echoing between the trees that suddenly seemed too tall and too close together. Sometimes from inside the walls themselves, as if he's found a way to exist in the spaces between normal reality. And I know with the terrible certainty that comes from experience that the trade isn't over. He took my voice, but not completely. He left me just enough to tell the story to people who might listen, might believe. Because warnings spread, and every person who hears them and ignores them, every hiker who goes into those woods despite the stories, feeds his power and adds to his collection. The perfect trap, a warning that can't be spoken clearly, told by someone who can't be fully believed. 1 week ago, the woman who escaped with me was found dead in her apartment. Sarah Chin, the hiker who traded her voice for freedom, who'd grabbed my hand and led me out of that nightmare forest. The police said she'd been dead for at least 3 days before her landlord found her. No signs of trauma. No indication of violence or struggle. She was sitting in her favorite chair, facing the mirror in her living room, with a peaceful expression on her face, like she'd simply decided to stop breathing. Only a note, written in her careful handwriting. He's inside the mirror now. Don't look. The trade was never about voices. It was about witnesses. He needed us to escape, and now he's here. Don't look in any mirrors. Don't whistle those 3 notes. And whatever you do, don't go back to the woods. He's not there anymore. He's everywhere. I try not to look. I really tried. I covered every mirror in my house with sheets and towels. Avoided bathroom mirrors, car mirrors, any reflective surface that might show me something I didn't want to see. For 3 days, I managed to avoid my own reflection completely. But curiosity got me. The same fatal curiosity that had led me deeper into the woods when I should have run. The same need to understand that had made me step closer to the hollow tree, to look into faces that should never have been preserved. I pulled the sheet away from the mirror in my hallway, and I saw my reflection. But it wasn't alone. Standing behind me, just over my left shoulder, was the whistling man. Not quite solid, more like a shadow given form, but unmistakably him. The same impossible grin, the same black eyes, the same two long limbs. My reflection was smiling a smile I wasn't making, whistling a tune I wasn't humming. The three notes I'd hoped never to hear again, low, high, low. As I watched in frozen horror, my reflection raised one finger to its lips, my lips, and made that same shushing sound. Then it spoke, using my voice, my mouth, my face. The trade is complete. Thank you for bringing me through. I stumbled backward, and the reflection didn't follow. It stayed in the mirror, grinning and whistling, while the whistling man behind it began to look more solid, more real. More here. That was a week ago. Since then, I've started hearing reports from other rangers, other parks. Hikers gone missing in places where no one should be able to disappear. Always the same pattern. Tents found intact, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away. And always, someone reports hearing whistling in the trees the night before. Three notes. Low, high, low. He's spreading. Moving from forest to forest, park to park, using the mirror network that connects every home, every bathroom, every reflective surface. The trade wasn't just about my voice or Sarah's warnings. It was about creating a doorway between his world and ours. And we opened it for him. They call him the Whistling Man. Some say he's the ghost of a lost ranger who never wanted company, driven mad by too many years alone in the wilderness. Some say he's the forest guardian, punishing those who lingered too long alone in places where humans weren't meant to walk. Others whisper that he's something much older, a thing that existed in the spaces between trees long before humans learned to walk upright, feeding on the lost and the lonely, growing stronger with each soul he claims. All I know is if you hear that melody in the woods, low, high, low, do not follow it. Don't answer it. Don't whistle back. And for God's sake, don't look too long into any mirrors after you've heard it. Because if you do, you'll never leave the forest hole. Even when you think you've escaped. Even when you're safe at home. The forest comes with you now. And he's always whistling, just out of sight, waiting for you to look. You ever watch someone watching you? I mean really watching. Not some passing glance, not a curious stranger at a trailhead, but that dead, locked-in stare that follows you like a curse. When I took the fire lookout post on Ridgeback Mountain, I thought I was prepared for isolation. I'd done wilderness stints before, solo shifts, bear run-ins, crazy storms, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what I saw, or what saw me. At first, it was just a shadow. A figure on the opposite ridge, always at twilight, standing still, watching. Then it got closer. No prints, no radio chatter, no signs of another soul in the area. Just the figure. Every night, staring. You might think isolation makes you see things. I did too at first, but then it knocked on my door, and my cameras caught nothing. This is the story of Fire Lookout 13, the cursed tower no one wants to talk about. The one they assign only to timps and rookies. The one where rangers go quiet or go missing. And I was next in line. I was assigned to Fire Lookout 13 in late September. The official reason was understaffing, which, in the Park Service, is code for no one wants this post. I'd heard the rumors from the older rangers. Radios going dead, strange lights, rangers reporting sightings they later denied. One guy quit mid-shift, hiked 12 miles overnight, and never worked another forest again. I laughed it off at the time. Superstition, I thought. Campfire stories to scare the rookies. The paperwork alone should have been a warning. The assignment folder was unusually thick, waivers, psychological evaluations, emergency protocols that seemed excessive for a standard fire watch. There were medical forms asking about my history with hallucinations, sleep disorders, and sensitivity to isolation stress. I signed them all without reading the fine print. Big mistake. Chief Ranger Hawkins handed me the keys with an expression I couldn't read. Radio check every 4 hours, he said, not meeting my eyes. No exceptions. Missed 2 checks, and we're sending a team up. Standard protocol? I asked. He paused at the door. For Lookout 13, yeah. Standard. The supply truck dropped me at the trailhead at dawn. The driver, a grizzled local named Pete, helped me unload my gear with unusual urgency. You been up there before? I asked. Pete shook his head, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. No, and won't be picking you up either. You radio when you're ready to come down, and I'll meet you at the bottom. Why not drive up the service road? Road's been washed out for years. He climbed back into his truck, then rolled down the window. Listen, son, you see anything weird up there, anything at all, you call it in. Don't try to be a hero. The hike up to the lookout was rough. Ridgeback's terrain is steep and eroded, and the tower sits like a nail hammered into the mountain spine. The trails switch back through dense pine and aspen, their leaves already turning the deep gold of early autumn. But something felt off about the forest. Too quiet. No birdsong. No squirrel chatter. Even the wind seemed muffled, as if the trees were holding their breath. Halfway up, I found the remains of an old campsite. The fire ring was ancient, filled with ash that looked fresh despite the recent rains. Around it, carved into the surrounding trees, were dozens of marks, scratch marks, like someone had clawed at the bark with their bare hands. Some of the gouges were deep enough to kill the trees, leaving them standing like gray skeletons. I took photos, though I couldn't say why. Something about the scene unsettled me in a way I couldn't articulate. The final approach to the tower was the worst part of the hike. The trail became a narrow ledge carved into the rock face, with a sheer drop on one side and an overhanging cliff on the other. The wind picked up here, howling through the gap like the mountain was screaming. When I finally saw the tower, my heart sank. Fire Lookout 13 perched on the ridge like a predator. It was older than I'd expected, probably built in the 1960s, with a steel frame that had rusted to the color of dried blood. The structure consisted of a small cabin mounted on stilts about 30 feet above the ground, with windows on all 4 sides and a catwalk running around the perimeter. A narrow staircase zigzagged up to the entrance, and the whole thing swayed in the wind with a groaning that sounded almost alive. It creaks when you walk. The wind howls like a banshee through the slats. But it had a panoramic view, miles of dense forest in all directions, fiery with autumn color. Beautiful. Quiet. Too quiet. The cabin itself was spartanly furnished, a narrow cot, a small table with radio equipment, shelves lined with emergency supplies, and the fire spotting gear, binoculars, range finders, maps marked with elevation lines and emergency access points. The windows were large and clean, offering an unobstructed view in every direction. On clear days, you could see for 50 miles or more. I spent the afternoon getting familiar with the equipment and establishing my routine. The radio worked fine, crackling to life when I tested it with Basecamp. The weather instruments were functional. The logbooks were current, though I noticed some odd entries from previous rangers. Notes about unusual atmospheric conditions and temperature anomalies that didn't correspond to any weather data. Day 1 passed uneventfully. I logged my check-ins, unpacked my supplies, and set my gear. I even took a photo of the sunset, the forest spread out below like a tapestry of gold and crimson. In hindsight, that photo was the last normal thing I captured. Because in the corner, barely visible in the tree lean about a mile to the northeast, stood a human-shaped silhouette. I didn't notice it at first. It was only later, when I was reviewing the images on my camera's LCD screen, that the shape caught my eye. A dark vertical line against the lighter background of the forest, too straight to be a tree, too tall to be a stump. I zoomed in as much as the camera would allow, but the resolution wasn't good enough to make out details. Probably just a dead snag, I told myself. Or maybe a hiker who'd stopped to rest. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something deep in my gut whispered otherwise. I zoomed in on the photo later that night, just killing time. The silhouette stood unnaturally straight. No gear. No reflective patches. No movement blur. It was still, almost too still. The more I stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. Hikers don't stand motionless for the length of time it would take to appear in a photograph without blur. Animals don't maintain perfect vertical posture. And there was something else. The figure appeared to be facing directly toward the tower. Toward me. I grabbed my binoculars and moved to the northeast window. The sun had set, leaving the forest in deep purple twilight, but I could still make out the general area where I'd seen the shape. I scanned the tree methodically, section by section. Nothing. But as I lowered the binoculars, something made me look again. A flash of movement, or maybe just the way the shadows seemed to shift. I raised the binoculars again and froze. There it was. The same vertical silhouette, but closer now. Much closer. What had been a mile away in the photograph was now maybe half that distance. And it was definitely a person, tall, motionless, and staring directly at the tower. My hands began to shake as I tried to keep the binoculars steady. The figure was too far away to make out features, but there was something profoundly unsettling about its posture. It stood with perfect stillness, arms at its sides, head tilted slightly as if listening. Or watching. I radioed dispatch. Base camp, this is Lookout 13. Come in. Static, then Lookout 13, this is base. Go ahead. Any hikers still in Zone 3? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A pause. I could hear the dispatcher checking records. No. Area's clear. Everyone off trail by 5 p.m. Why, you got eyes on someone? I hesitated. Maybe. Just wanted to confirm. Could be a local. Sometimes they don't check in. Want us to investigate. No, that's okay. Just checking. Copy that. Radio check in 4 hours. I signed off and returned to the window. The figure was gone. I spent the next hour scanning the entire visible area with binoculars, checking and rechecking the spot where I'd seen it. Nothing moved in the growing darkness except the gentle sway of tree branches in the evening breeze. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd been seeing things, tricks of shadow and light, the kind of optical illusions that were common in wilderness areas. But I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I set up my sleeping bag on the narrow cot, even took a mild sleep aid I'd brought for just such occasions. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt exposed. The tower had windows on all 4 sides, and even with the curtains drawn, I could sense the vast darkness pressing in around me. I left the tower floodlights on, ostensibly for security, but really for my own peace of mind, and sat with the radio in my lap, listening to the static and the wind. Around midnight, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath fogging in the cabin air, despite the fact that the day had been warm and the weather forecast called for mild nights. I checked the thermometer, 42 degrees. That was at least 20 degrees colder than it should have been. I made a note in the logbook. Unusual temperature drop at 2,400 hours. Possible equipment malfunction, but the backup thermometer read the same. At 1:30 a.m., the wind died completely. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the howling had been. Without the constant background noise, every small sound seemed amplified. The settling of the tower's metal frame, the tick of the weather instruments, my own breathing. And then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., there was a knock. Not a rustle. Not an animal brushing the wall. A deliberate, measured, 3-tap knock on the steel hatch below the tower. Tap, tap, tap. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The sound had been unmistakable, knuckles on metal, from directly below. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the trapdoor that led to the staircase. The hatch was closed and latched from the inside, just as I'd left it. I scrambled to the window and peered down at the base of the tower. The floodlights illuminated the immediate area in harsh white light, casting deep shadows between the support struts. No one. I checked the motion-activated cameras I'd set up around the perimeter. The monitors showed 4 different angles of the tower's base and the surrounding area. Nothing. My rational mind offered explanations. Thermal expansion of the metal causing settling sounds, a branch falling from above, maybe even a large bird colliding with the structure. But the sound had been too rhythmic, too purposeful. And it had come from directly below the hatch, not from the sides or above. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the radio, checking and rechecking the camera feeds. Nothing moved in the pools of light around the tower. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the darkness beyond the reach of the floods, watching and waiting. When dawn finally came, painting the forest in soft pastels, I felt foolish. Isolation paranoia, I told myself. Classic symptoms. Every ranger experienced it to some degree during solo assignments. But when I opened the hatch to descend for my morning perimeter check, I found a boot print. It was pressed into a small patch of ash that had accumulated on the metal grating of the landing, ash that hadn't been there the day before. The print was large, size 11 or 12, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't mine. My boots had deep lug soles for traction on rough terrain. This print was smooth, with no tread pattern at all. Just the outline of a naked foot, pressed into ash as if someone had been standing there barefoot. But that was impossible. The nearest ground was 30 feet below, and the only way up was the staircase I just descended. A staircase that would have triggered at least 3 motion sensors. I took photographs of the print from multiple angles, then carefully brushed it into an evidence bag. Not that I planned to report it, but some instinct told me to preserve it. As I worked, I noticed something else. The ash itself was still warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air. And it smelled like smoke from a fire that was still burning. By day 3, my nerves were shot. The isolation was getting to me in ways I hadn't anticipated, and the strange incidents were piling up. The radio began cutting out, even during clear weather. Not just static, complete dead air, as if someone was jamming the frequency. Batteries drained twice as fast as they should have, even though I'd brought spares rated for extreme conditions. But worst of all, the figure came back. Every evening, just before sundown, I spotted it again, closer each time. It didn't move during the daylight hours that I could observe, but each night it appeared several hundred yards nearer to the tower. It didn't wave. It didn't gesture. It just stood there, motionless as a statue, head tilted at that same unnatural angle. On the second night, I tried using the powerful LED spotlight to illuminate the area where it stood. The beam reached easily across the distance, but when it hit the spot where the figure should have been, there was nothing there. Just empty forest. But the moment I turned the light away, it was back, visible in my peripheral vision. I called it in again, more insistent this time. Base camp, this is Lookout 13. I need to report a possible trespasser in Zone 3. Copy, Lookout 13. Can you describe the individual? I paused, realizing how crazy I was about to sound. Tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3". Wearing dark clothing. Standing motionless in the tree line approximately 800 yards northeast of my position. Any signs of distress? Appeared lost or injured? Negative. Just standing there, watching the tower. Another pause. We'll note it in the log. Could be a local hunter scouting the area. Season opens next week. It's been there for 3 nights running. Same spot, same position. The dispatcher's tone became slightly patronizing. Must be a hiker then, or your imagination. You know how isolation can play tricks on the mind, but I knew better. I'd started keeping detailed logs of the sightings, complete with sketches and timestamps. The figure appeared consistently at 6:47 p.m., just as the last light began to fade from the western sky. It remained visible until approximately 11:15 p.m., then vanished sometime before my midnight check. On this third night, I decided to get scientific about it. I used the thermal scope that was part of the fire detection equipment, a high-end military surplus unit capable of detecting heat signatures at extreme range. The shape was there, clearly visible through the regular binoculars. I switched to thermal imaging and aimed at the exact same spot. Nothing. No heat signature at all. The thermal scope showed the ambient temperature of the trees and rocks, the cooling air of evening, even the warm spots where sunlight had heated the ground during the day. But where the figure stood, there was absolutely nothing. Not cold, not hot, just an absence of thermal information, as if the space itself was somehow blank. I switched back to regular optics. The figure was still there. Thermal again. Nothing. Regular vision. Still there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the equipment steady. Whatever I was looking at, it wasn't generating heat like a living creature should. It wasn't reflecting heat like an inanimate object would. It was simply absent from the thermal spectrum entirely. I set up cameras, motion-triggered, full perimeter coverage, with overlapping fields of view to eliminate blind spots. Professional grade trail cameras with infrared capability, the kind used for wildlife research. If something was moving around a tower, they would catch it. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat at the observation desk with all the monitors arranged in front of me, watching 8 different camera feeds simultaneously. The tower's floodlights created pools of harsh white light, but beyond their reach, the forest was an impenetrable wall of darkness. At 10:30 p.m., I spotted movement on camera 3, a shadow passing between the trees, just at the edge of the light. I leaned forward, studying the grainy footage. Nothing triggered the motion detection. I rewound the feed and watched again. There, a dark shape moving from left to right, definitely bipedal, definitely human-sized. But the camera registered it as background, no different from the swaying branches or shifting shadows. I checked the other feeds. Whatever had been moving was now outside their range, but I had the unsettling feeling it was circling the tower, staying just beyond the reach of the lights. At 2:46 a.m., the cameras all went black, one by one, in sequence, as if something was moving around the perimeter and disabling them individually. Not static, not equipment failure, just darkness. The monitors showed nothing but black screens with no signal indicators. I grabbed my handheld radio and tried to call base camp, but got only dead air. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual given the remote location, but the complete radio blackout was wrong. Emergency frequencies should always be open. Then came the knocking again. Only this time it came from inside the tower. The sound was coming from directly below me, from the main floor of the cabin. 3 measured taps, just like before, but muffled by the floorboards. Tap, tap, tap. I rose, heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. The tower was small, just 2 levels with nowhere to hide. I grabbed the heavy mag light from the equipment rack and moved to the trapdoor that led to the lower level. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish even as I said it. Silence. I lifted the trapdoor and shone my light down into the storage area below. Boxes of emergency supplies, weather instruments, spare batteries. All exactly as I'd left them. I climbed down and cleared every inch of the lower level, even the crawl space under the supply floor where the electrical systems were housed. The space was barely 3 feet high and filled with cables and junction boxes, but I crawled through every square foot of it. Nothing. No signs of entry, no disturbed dust, no footprints in the accumulated grime. The external doors were still locked from the inside. The windows were secure and showed no signs of tampering. When I climbed back up to the observation deck, something was different. On my cot, placed precisely in the center of the pillow, sat a scrap of paper. I approached it slowly, the flashlight beam wavering in my unsteady grip. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and covered with what looked like soot or ash. Written across it in a shaky hand, as if the writer had been struggling against something, were 4 words. I see you, too. The handwriting was barely legible, formed by someone pressing hard enough to tear through the paper in places. Below the message was something that might have been a signature, but it was too smeared with ash to make out clearly. I photographed the note from every angle, then carefully placed it in a plastic evidence bag. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the seal. The paper felt wrong somehow, not just old, but somehow charged, as if it retained the fear and desperation of whoever had written it. The cameras came back online at dawn, all functioning normally, showing nothing but empty forest and morning sunlight. The radio crackled back to life as if nothing had happened. When base camp called for the morning check-in, I almost didn't answer. Lookout 13, this is base camp. Come in. I stared at the radio for a long moment, then picked up the handset. Base camp, this is Lookout 13. All clear. Copy that. Everything normal up there. I looked at the evidence bag containing the note, at the photos on my camera, at the logs I've been keeping of impossible sightings. All normal, I lied. At dawn, I scanned for signs. Maybe someone had snuck up during the night, playing an elaborate prank. Maybe there was a rational explanation for everything that had been happening. But as I examined the area around the tower in the growing light, I found only more questions. The forest was still. Dead still. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the ever-present wind had died to nothing, leaving the trees motionless as painted scenery. I climbed down from the tower and conducted a thorough perimeter search, looking for any sign of human presence. The motion sensor cameras had recorded nothing during their blackout, but I wanted to check the physical evidence myself. What I found made my skin crawl. Around the base of the tower, in a perfect circle about 20 feet in diameter, the ground was different. Not obviously, so you'd have to look carefully to notice it. But once seen, it was unmistakable. The earth within the circle was darker, more compacted, as if it had been subjected to intense heat. The grass was shorter and grew in sparse, uneven patches. Even the insects seemed to avoid the area. But most disturbing were the trees. Every tree that stood within or partially within the circle showed signs of damage. Not obvious fire damage, no char marks or obvious burns, but something subtler. The bark had a grayish tinge, and when I scraped it with my knife, it crumbled like ash. The leaves, even on the evergreens, had a withered quality despite the mild weather. I took soil samples from inside and outside the circle, noting the temperature difference. Inside, 58 degrees. Outside, 42 degrees, normal for the altitude and season. The soil inside the circle was warm to the touch, as if heated from below. I was documenting this anomaly when I saw the smoke. Northwest quadrant, maybe 3 miles out. Light gray column rising straight up in the still air, the kind of smoke that indicated a small, controlled burn or maybe a campfire. But something about it seemed wrong. The smoke was too straight, too perfect, rising without the slightest deviation despite the complex air currents that should have been present in the mountainous terrain. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the source. The smoke appeared to be coming from a small clearing in the forest, but I couldn't see the fire itself through the canopy. I noted the coordinates and called it in. Base camp, this is Lookout 13. I have eyes on smoke, northwest quadrant, approximately 3 miles from my position. Coordinates follow. Copy, Lookout 13. We'll send a drone for aerial assessment. The drone arrived within 30 minutes, a small, silent aircraft that will provide real-time video feed to both the base camp and my terminal in the tower. I watched the monitor as the drone approached the coordinates I'd provided. But what it showed chilled me to the bone. The aerial view revealed the clearing I'd spotted, a roughly circular open area about 50 yards across. But there was no fire, no smoke, no signs of any recent burning. Just empty forest, with trees that looked healthy and undisturbed. Yet when I looked up from the monitor and scanned the area with my naked eyes, the smoke was still there. A clear, unambiguous column of gray rising into the sky, exactly where it had been before. Drone operator to Lookout 13, we're not seeing any signs of fire at your reported coordinates. Can you confirm the location? I double-checked my rangefinder and compass readings. Confirmed. The smoke is clearly visible from my position. Pause. Lookout 13, our thermal imaging shows normal ground temperature. No heat signatures. Are you certain you're seeing smoke? I stared at the monitor, then at the view through my binoculars. The discrepancy was impossible to reconcile. The drone's camera showed peaceful forest, while my direct observation revealed an active smoke column. The smoke is right there. I'm looking at it right now. Copy. We'll make a note in the log. Possible atmospheric anomaly or equipment malfunction. Continue monitoring. The drone circled the area for another 10 minutes, providing multiple angles and high-resolution imagery. Every frame showed the same thing. Undisturbed forest with no signs of fire or smoke. But I continued to watch the smoke rise throughout the day. And in the smoke, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, I began to see shapes. At first, they were just suggestions of form, denser areas in the smoke that might have been coincidental patterns. But as I watched, they became more defined. Human shapes, moving within the column of smoke as if dancing or struggling. Figures with arms raised, heads thrown back, mouths open in what might have been screams or songs. I tried sketching what I saw, but my drawings looked like the work of a madman. Twisted figures writhing in smoke that only I could see, rising from a fire that didn't exist. As evening approached, I noticed something else. The figure I'd been seeing each night at twilight, it wasn't in its usual position in the tree lane. Instead, something was moving through the forest, heading directly toward the source of the impossible smoke. Not walking, gliding, moving between the trees with a fluid motion that didn't match human locomotion, covering ground faster than should have been possible. Through my binoculars, I could see it weaving through the forest, approaching the clearing where the smoke originated. When it reached the clearing, it stopped, and the smoke began to change. What had been a simple column of gray smoke began to darken, taking on a reddish tinge like smoke from a fire fueled by something other than wood. The shapes within it became more distinct, more obviously human. I could make out faces now, expressions of terror or ecstasy frozen in the rising smoke. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, definitely human shape but somehow wrong in its proportions, too tall and too thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides. As I watched, it raised one hand toward the smoke, and the smoke began to move, not rising straight up as it had all day, but bending, flowing toward the tower like a river of gray and red flowing uphill through the air. The column of smoke began to stretch across the 3 miles of forest that separated the clearing from my position, maintaining its coherence as it approached. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and pack. My water was running low, and exhaustion was setting in. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing certainty that I was being herded. Every time I tried to break away from the established trails, the forest became impassable, thick tangles of thorns and deadfall that seemed to appear from nowhere. Every time I found what looked like a way out, it led me in a wide circle back to the same accursed tower. The whispers grew louder as darkness approached, and with them came other sounds. Footsteps that matched my pace, always just out of sight. The crack of breaking branches that suggested something large moving parallel to my path. And underneath it all, a low humming sound like electricity running through power lines that seemed to vibrate in my bones. By nightfall, I was back at the tower, exhausted and terrified. I climbed the stairs on legs that felt like rubber, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door latch. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. Waiting on my cot was a ranger's badge, but not mine. The nameplate read Ranger David Kroll in faded letters. The badge was tarnished with age and heat damage, the metal warped as if it had been subjected to intense fire. But the serial number was clearly visible, and when I checked it against the records I've been keeping, it matched the badge that had supposedly been retired after Kroll's disappearance in 1998. His body was never found, just a patch of scorched earth at the base of this very tower. Earth that, I now realized, matched the burned circle I discovered around the current structure. I held the badge up to the light, and for a moment, I could swear I heard Kroll's voice among the whispers that filled the cabin. A desperate, pleading sound that seemed to say, "Don't let them take you too." But it was too late for warnings. As I sat there holding the badge of a dead man, I realized that I was no longer alone in the cabin. Something was standing behind me. I could feel its presence, a cold, oppressive weight that made the air itself seem thick and hard to breathe. I could hear its breathing, slow and rhythmic, like bellows feeding a forge. And when I finally worked up the courage to turn around, I saw it clearly for the first time. The watcher stood in the corner of the cabin, its impossible height forcing it to stoop beneath the ceiling. Up close, its true nature was even more horrifying than I'd imagined. Its skin was the color and texture of charcoal, with fissures that glowed with inner fire. Its eyes were empty sockets that somehow still conveyed intelligence and malevolent intent. And when it spoke, its voice was the sound of flames consuming dry wood. "You have seen us," it said, the words causing frost to form on the windows despite the heat that radiated from its body. "You have heard our voices. You know what happened here." I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The watcher stepped closer, and I could smell the scent of old fires, of things that had burned long ago and never quite stopped smoldering. "This place is a doorway," it continued. "A thin spot between what is and what was. The rangers who came before you opened that door with their fear, their isolation, their desperate need to understand. And now they cannot leave." The whispers rose around us, confirming what I'd already begun to suspect. Every ranger who'd been assigned to Lookout 13, everyone who'd gone missing or quit suddenly or simply disappeared, was still here, trapped in the smoke and flame that existed in the spaces between reality, their voices adding to the chorus that called out to each new victim. "You can join them willingly," the watcher said, extending one impossibly long arm toward me. "Or you can fight and join them anyway. The choice changes nothing. The door, once opened, does not close." I looked at the badge in my hands, at the name of a man who'd made the same choice I was being offered now. Around me, the whispers grew more urgent, more desperate. Some were pleading with me to resist, to find a way out that they had not. Others were urging me to give in, to end the fear and uncertainty and join their eternal vigil. But I wasn't ready to become another voice in that terrible chorus. Not yet. Deep backward from the window, knocking over my chair. This was impossible. Smoke didn't behave this way. It rose with convection currents and dispersed in the wind. It didn't flow horizontally through the air like a sentient creature. But as I watched in growing horror, the smoke continued its approach. Within minutes, tendrils of it were flowing around the tower, seeping through gaps in the walls, bringing with it the smell of a fire that burned more than wood. It smelled like burning flesh. And in the smoke that now filled the cabin, I could hear whispers. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the cabin with voices that seemed to emanate from the smoke itself. Not one voice, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in a susurrus of sound that made my skin crawl. "Stay. Look. Burn. See what we see. Feel what we felt." The words weren't quite English, but I understood them anyway, as if they were being spoken directly into my mind rather than through my ears. They were pleas and commands and warnings all at once, delivered in tones that ranged from desperate whispers to anguished moans. I grabbed my emergency respirator from the equipment rack and strapped it on, but it didn't help. The smoke wasn't just in the air. It was in the cabin, in the walls, seeping up through the floorboards and down through the ceiling. It moved with purpose, flowing around obstacles, reaching for me with tendrils that felt almost solid. And in the smoke, I began to see them clearly. Faces. Human faces, but wrong somehow. Distorted by heat and suffering, with eyes that held the look of people who had seen their own deaths approaching. Men and women, young and old, all trapped in the flowing smoke, all reaching toward me with desperate, grasping hands. I recognized one of them, Ranger David Kroll, whose badge I'd found on my cot. But his face was burned, twisted with an expression of terminal agony. His mouth was open in a scream I couldn't hear over the whispers, and his eyes held an accusation that made me want to look away. But I couldn't look away. The smoke held me transfixed, and the faces kept coming. More Rangers, I realized. Dozens of them, all wearing the burned remnants of Park Service uniforms, all bearing the marks of a death by fire. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Don't leave us here. Stay and burn. Add your voice to ours. The Watcher is waiting." I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the radio. I had to call for help, had to report what was happening, even if they thought I was insane. But when I reached for the handset, my fingers passed through it as if it were made of smoke. Everything in the cabin was becoming insubstantial, wavering like a mirage. The walls, the furniture, the floor beneath my feet, all of it was dissolving into the same gray-red smoke that filled the air. I was standing in nothing, surrounded by the whispers of the dead, while reality itself burned away around me. Through the dissolving walls, I could see the forest. But it wasn't the forest I knew. The trees were black skeletons, their branches reaching toward a sky the color of old blood. The ground was charred and cracked, with fissures that glowed with the light of fires burning far below. And in the distance, towering above the devastated landscape, stood a figure I'd been seeing every night. But now I could see it clearly. It wasn't human. It had never been human. It stood 12 feet tall, with proportions that hurt to look at directly. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. Its face was a void beneath a crown of what might have been hair or might have been flame. And when it turned its attention toward me, I felt the weight of its regard like a physical blow. The Watcher. The thing that had been drawing closer each night, feeding on the fear and isolation of whoever was assigned to this cursed tower. The entity that had been collecting Rangers for decades, adding their voices to the chorus of whispers that filled the smoke. It began to move toward me, not walking but flowing across the burned landscape like liquid shadow. With each step, the ground beneath its feet cracked and smoldered, leaving footprints of ash that glowed with inner fire. I ran. I packed my bag that night, or tried to. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely function, and every few seconds I'd stop to listen for the whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that I was having a breakdown, that isolation and stress had finally pushed me over the edge. But the evidence was too consistent, too detailed, too terrifyingly real to dismiss as hallucination. I had to get out. Had to get off the mountain and back to civilization before whatever was hunting me could add my voice to its collection. But the forest had other plans. I left at first light, taking only essential supplies and abandoning the tower without reporting to base camp. The trail down the mountain should have been straightforward. I'd hiked it just 4 days earlier. But within an hour of leaving the tower, I realized I was lost. Every trail I took looped me back toward the tower. Not obviously, the paths felt different, wound through terrain I didn't remember seeing before. But inevitably, after hours of hiking, I'd catch a glimpse of the familiar steel structure through the trees, perched on its ridge like a malevolent lighthouse. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd taken a wrong turn. I consulted my map and compass, reoriented myself, and chose a different path. But 3 hours later, there was the tower again, from a different angle, but unmistakably the same structure. The second time, panic began to set in. I checked my GPS unit, but it showed no signal despite the clear sky. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The sun seemed to move differently than it should, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. By the third loop back to the tower, I realized I was trapped. The forest around me was changing as I walked. Paths appeared where none had been before, leading me in directions that felt right but ended up being wrong. Trees moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, repositioning themselves to block certain routes and encourage others. And always, in my peripheral vision, I could see shapes moving between the trunks, tall, dark figures that vanished when I turned to look at them directly. No GPS, no compass, no sun to navigate by. Just that strange fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself and the constant whispering. Yes, whispers. Dozens of voices, low and brittle, like leaves rubbing against skin. They came from all directions, sometimes seeming to originate from the trees themselves, sometimes from the fog, sometimes from inside my own head. Lost. Stay. Join us. Look. Burn. The watcher sees all paths. I stumble.